She was an island beauty with everything going for her.
She was a runner-up in Miss Bahamas competition.
She just has the look and the personality.
He was the old flame she followed to America.
He missed her, she missed him.
They reunited and picked up right where they left off.
But after 4 blissful weeks, it all goes wrong.
He dropped off at the airport to go back home.
All of a sudden, she just falls off the face of the earth.
She never got on the plane.
Family and friends are frantic to find the missing woman.
They were concerned, very concerned.
Mom flooded her phone until the voicemails backed up.
She's afraid her daughter's been kidnapped.
But the truth is far worse.
She got caught up with very evil people.
What they did really struck a nerve with me.
There's some level of jealousy, hatred, vindictiveness. It's evil.
The horror that she endured was unimaginable.
February 28th, 2006. It's a quiet evening in Cocoa, Florida, a small coastal town just 45 minutes from Orlando.
Cocoa is a small town of about 16,000 people, directly west of Cocoa Beach. Pretty heavy tourist area.
It's a working class town, home to the folks who staff the attractions and hotels.
But at 12:30 a.m., residents in the Pine Acres neighborhood are about to be awakened by a violent scene.
People heard multiple gunshots and immediately calls to 911 began pouring in.
When detectives arrive, they see a man lying on the ground covered in blood.
Is that who I think it is?
They're able to quickly ID the man, who was well known to police as a drug dealer named Willie Parker.
When we arrived, Willie Parker was dead next to his vehicle in the front yard of a house.
He was on the ground with the door open, blood all over the place.
There were drugs in his vehicle. He had several prior arrests for drug sales.
However, detectives suspect the murder was more personal than a robbery or drug hit.
They didn't take his money, they didn't take his watch, they didn't take nothing. So we know it wasn't a robbery.
What detectives don't know is that what starts as an investigation into a murdered drug dealer will soon turn into a search for a missing young woman from the Bahamas, and a shocking crime that will take them 4 years to solve.
Never in a million years would detectives have predicted these 2 cases were connected.
It's one of the most bizarre twists that you can imagine.
She was loved, and she didn't deserve this. She did not deserve this situation.
22-year-old Bahamas native Doris Knowles was as dazzling as the crystal blue water and brilliant white beaches of the islands she called home.
Her beauty is kind of breathtaking. Everyone who sees her say, oh my God, who is that?
She competed in beauty pageants and was actually the runner-up in the Miss Bahamas Universe pageant in 2004.
She could do anything. She had the brains, she had the look, she had the personality, she had everything. She kind of a firecracker.
Doris had put her award-winning personality to work at the Bahamas Ministry of Tourism.
She worked for the Bahama Host Program, which trained hospitality workers in customer service skills, sort of making sure that they represented the island right.
The pseudo personality, just being smart and bubbly.
However, she had bigger dreams.
She was in college. She was very focused.
She was considering medical school.
She was really smart, so she's like the top in class. She had a bright future.
By the fall of 2004, Doris thought she'd found someone to share her future with too, in fellow islander, 27-year-old Christopher Pratt.
He was educated in the Bahamas, and their families knew each other.
Christopher was about 5 years older when he and Doris met. She was drawn to his maturity. Christopher was almost like a protector, a little bit more experienced.
However, in November of 2005, this young couple's love would be put on hold.
I don't want us to stay like this forever.
I know, me too, babe.
Christopher Pratt had found some financial opportunities in Florida that he couldn't pass up. So now he had to break the news to Doris that he was leaving the Bahamas for Florida.
Everyone growing up in the Bahamas looking for a way out in terms of trying to make it, you know?
He had a cousin here, and they were doing like a construction business.
I don't want you to go.
I know, but I have to.
Christopher promised that the separation would only be temporary.
Let me go over, get things going. When I get settled, you come over.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Over the next several months, the couple maintained a long-distance relationship.
They were in contact with each other while he was in the U.S., and he kept asking her to move over here to be with him.
So he offered to buy her a plane ticket to bring her to Cocoa so they could be together. He really missed her. He really wanted to be with her.
She missed him just as much as he missed her and agreed to come over.
On February 15th, 2006, after several months apart, Doris and Christopher were reunited, if only for a few weeks.
It was intent just to spend time with him, see if it's even going to be something that she would want to stay here long term.
Christopher and Doris picked up right where they left off, and for the next 4 weeks, their romance was as strong as ever.
Once they got back together, it was almost like no time had passed at all. That connection between Christopher and Doris was very deep.
If anything, the distance between the two of them made their passion stronger.
When the time came for Doris to return to the Bahamas, Christopher continued to try to convince her that her place was with him.
You know I want you to stay, right?
I'll come back. Maybe for good.
Doris wanted to be with him, but making the move to Florida wasn't as easy as Christopher hoped.
Doris explained she couldn't leave her family like that. She was very close with her parents, so it was a big decision.
She was a good person. She loved her mom, and she was always keeping in touch with her.
My mom spoke with her daughter frequently, like a couple times a week.
But now, on March 21st, 4 days after Doris was due to arrive back in the Bahamas, her mother can't reach her.
She's not answering her phone.
She called her daughter repeatedly.
Doris had given her mom Christopher's number in case she couldn't get a hold of her.
Come on.
Yeah, hello?
Christopher,
Hey, Miss Knowles.
is Doris there?
Nah, what you mean?
She's not answering the phone.
Wait, she ain't call you when she landed?
No.
That's impossible. I dropped off at the airport myself.
What?
Christopher's news makes Doris's mother even more concerned than she was before.
That left her worried. This was completely unlike Doris.
They knew that something had happened.
When the Cocoa police get involved, all signs point to a disturbing possibility.
Her passport activity was non-existent.
She never got on the plane.
At the beginning of March 2006, 22-year-old Doris Knowles was having the time of her life in Florida.
She'd come over from the Bahamas in February to rekindle things with her old flame, Christopher Pratt.
He cared for her, he loved her, he wanted her to move to Florida to be with him.
But by March 21st, it's been 4 days since Doris has had contact with her family, and her mother is worried sick.
Doris was known to keep in touch with her family, her mom in particular. Every day she would call her.
And when Doris's mom reaches out to Christopher, he says that he dropped her off at the airport.
Yo, she ain't call you when she landed?
No.
He thought she had gone home to see her family.
In a panic, Doris's mom contacts her daughter's friends in the Bahamas to see if anyone has spoken to or seen Doris.
Pick up the phone.
She also contacts police in Doris's last known location, Cocoa, Florida.
I'd like to file a missing persons report.
Mrs. Knowles is transferred to a detective with the Cocoa Police Department.
Caravano, Cocoa Police.
I spoke with Mrs. Knowles. She said that it was unusual for her not to, call and say, hey, Mom, I'm okay. So that raised flags with us also at that point.
My boyfriend took her to the airport.
Yes. She was supposed to be home days ago, but I haven't heard from her.
You have the hope that something hasn't happened? and she's just somewhere else. But I think they knew in the back of her mind something has happened.
It's not like her to disappear like this.
Okay, man, we're gonna do all we can to help find your daughter. I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
After talking to Doris's mom, the Cocoa police begin their investigation.
We was reaching out with customs, the airport police, to try to find out if she did cross back.
So when we checked with customs immigration, there's no passport activity.
Which means Doris never got on the plane.
So now detectives start to wonder if she made it to the airport at all.
Detectives decide it's time they talk to Christopher Pratt.
He was staying at one of the local motels here in Cocoa.
Christopher Pratt? Yeah.
We need to ask you a few questions about Doris Knowles.
Did y'all find her?
He seemed genuinely concerned about Doris and wanted to know if she was okay.
He was forthcoming and wanted to cooperate with us.
However, Christopher has no new information for detectives.
Christopher Pratt told us that he took her to the airport to fly her back to the Bahamas and has not seen her since.
Did you make sure she got on the plane?
No, man, I just dropped her off.
Can you think of anywhere else she might have gone?
No.
At this point in the investigation, detectives have little reason to doubt Christopher's story.
He cared for her enough to ask her to move from the Bahamas, to leave her family, and to move over here to be with him.
It's all my fault, man.
Why do you say that?
Because I should have never asked her to come.
He's very quiet, soft-spoken. He doesn't seem like the person that would be aggressive.
We'll let you know if we hear anything.
When detectives return to the station and run Christopher's name through their database, the results appear to confirm their first impression of Doris's boyfriend.
He didn't have a criminal background at all.
No speeding tickets, nothing.
But when the detectives run Doris's name, something does pop up.
There was a disturbance at a bar downtown in Cocoa, and one of our officers had responded.
She was given a citation.
It's a trespass warning, dated March 15th, 2 days before Doris's family lost contact with her.
Detectives figure that that can't be a coincidence.
So we looked into that call, who the officer was that handled the call.
The officer's name is Thomas Shaw, and detectives waste no time bringing him in to talk.
You want to see me?
Yeah, come in, have a seat. Doris Knowles, you wrote up for trespassing a few days ago.
Yeah, I remember her.
According to Shaw, it was a routine incident.
She's this gorgeous girl. Guys are hovering, buying her drinks.
She had a little bit too much to drink. It was getting a little loud.
The bartender ended up asking her to leave.
An argument ensues and things get out of hand.
Once police were called, Officer Shaw responded to the scene.
He states that he gave her a trespass warning and asked her to leave.
Did she comply?
Yeah, I mean, she did it without any trouble. And that's it. Not exactly.
What the officer tells them next adds a new twist to Doris's disappearance.
He did meet with Doris Knowles off duty, and then he hooks up with her. They have a sexual encounter.
Detectives start to wonder if Christopher knew about this.
Could this be a case of jealousy or a hookup gone terribly wrong?
There's some level of jealousy, hatred, vindictiveness. He's watching his girlfriend with another man.
Cocoa detectives investigating the disappearance of Doris Knowles have just discovered that the 22-year-old Bahamian had an encounter with police 2 days before she disappeared.
In fact, Doris partied so hard that the bartender didn't only cut her off, he also ended up calling the cops.
Cocoa patrolman Thomas Shaw was the responding officer.
He talked with her and they calmed the situation down there. He put her in his patrol car.
Though Shaw admits, things then took a somewhat unprofessional turn.
The officer began talking to Doris, and of course, she was a very beautiful girl. Gorgeous.
According to Officer Shaw, that was his last call for the night. So after driving Doris to the motel where she stayed with Christopher Pratt, They talked for hours and then exchanged phone numbers.
We pressed that issue a little bit more, and Officer Shaw said that he gave his number to her to contact him if she was interested in meeting, having dinner, hanging out.
And the following evening, the off-duty officer picked up Doris for a date, not knowing she was involved with Christopher Pratt.
All of a sudden, detectives learned that Doris and Christopher may have been on the outs.
Shaw says that when he picked up Doris, a man followed her out of the motel room and talked to her in the parking lot.
Shaw says he doesn't know who the guy was, but his description matches Christopher Pratt.
According to Shaw, it looked like they were having an argument.
What was that about?
Nothing.
All right, where to?
How about your place?
That's cool.
Shaw says Doris ended up spending the night.
He hooks up with her. They have a sexual encounter.
They want to know exactly what his relationship was with her. They ask all sorts of questions.
You never saw her again? I tried calling her, but she never answered my call or called me back.
Officer Shaw insisted that it was a one-time thing.
Like, y'all ought to be out there talking to the guy that she was staying with. Her boyfriend, if you want to call it that. She told me they haven't been getting along.
Detectives begin to suspect that Christopher Pratt had kept this information from them.
They were currently dating and still living together, and she's now with another man. I would definitely speculate that there's some level of jealousy.
And if Christopher knew that she spent the night with this man, could that have sent his jealousy to the next level?
Detectives need to have another talk with Christopher. But when they return to the motel, they discover that he's checked out of his room.
It'd been cleaned and turned over.
Detectives put out a bolo for Christopher Pratt and continue to search for Doris.
We're just waiting to see what other type of leads we can get.
Weeks pass with no new leads. But on April 12th, 2006, Cocoa detectives get a call from South Carolina State Police.
Really?
The trooper informs Cocoa detectives about 3 arrests he'd made the night before.
Can I see your license registration, please?
A South Carolina state trooper was acting on a tip about drugs coming through the state.
There were 3 men in the car. 27-year-old Batiste Kirkman, the driver, 31-year-old David Willis, and 27-year-old Christopher Pratt.
Where y'all headed to?
New York. See some friends.
New York, huh?
Yeah.
Made y'all step out of the vehicle.
Police had a tip about this particular vehicle transporting drugs.
It didn't take long for the tip to pay off.
When they searched their car, they found drugs, and they found a firearm.
They collect the firearm and send it off to be tested.
Police took the 3 men into custody, unaware of the Florida bolo for Christopher regarding Doris's disappearance. But David Willis claims to have information that would blow the case wide open.
David Willis starts swearing up and down that he didn't have any involvement with him. He didn't know the stuff was in the car with them.
I was just driving the car.
Them being in this vehicle in South Carolina, they were going to charge them federally.
He was telling the authorities there in South Carolina that he needs to talk to the police back in Cocoa.
David Willis says to the officers, "Let me tell you what I know."
He says that he has some information about a murder.
Hurry up, let's go!
April 12th, 2006. It's been more than 3 weeks since 22-year-old Doris Knowles disappeared in Cocoa, Florida. But detectives working the case are about to make an unexpected breakthrough.
Caravano, Cocoa Police.
I got a call that there were 3 Cocoa boys arrested in South Carolina.
They're 27-year-old Batiste Kirkman, 31-year-old David Willis, and 27-year-old Christopher Pratt, Doris's boyfriend.
Batiste, Christopher, and David were actually traveling to New York when they were stopped in South Carolina.
They were going to New York to flip some drugs. They had cocaine, marijuana, an abundance of it on them.
While detectives are surprised to learn Christopher is involved in a drug deal, it's the intel offered by David Willis that catches their attention.
Once he was arrested, David Willis tells deputies in South Carolina he has information about a murder.
At that time, we drove South Carolina.
In South Carolina, detectives find Willis eager to talk.
The drug charges and the firearm charges, he could have been looking at 10, 15 years, and he was trying to mitigate that.
But when detectives sit down with David Willis, they are surprised about whose murder he wants to discuss.
They thought this would be a big revelation about what happened to Doris, but it's not.
Guy named Willie Parker.
Detectives know exactly who David Willis is talking about.
It's a drug dealer. He was shot and killed in Cocoa.
The murder had occurred on February 28, 2006, 3 weeks before Doris's disappearance.
Okay, what can you tell us about the Parker murder?
Batiste killed him.
Batiste Kirkman was well known to police.
According to Willis, Batiste had a vendetta against Parker for moving in on his girlfriend.
Batiste killed him.
Yeah. And you looked him in the eyes. No conscience. It's crazy.
He said he was psychopathic. He would just kill people. Everybody feared Batiste.
Willis claims that on that night in February, Batiste staked out Willie Parker's home, waiting for him to come out.
Willie Parker was standing outside. They drove up. Kirkman got out, shot him multiple times.
Hey, yo, Willie!
Willis claims Batiste was the shooter. But another man was driving.
The getaway driver in the shooting of Willie Parker was Christopher Pratt.
Go, man, let's go, man. Hurry up, man.
But how does Christopher's involvement in Willie Parker's murder connect to Doris's disappearance?
Was Doris Knowles caught up in any of this?
Doris?
Pratt's girlfriend.
Yeah, I know who she is.
Where is she?
She's dead.
What Willis tells them next is beyond belief.
What happened to Doris Knowles?
I don't know, but I know they buried her.
How do you know that?
I took Batiste to get the shovel.
Willis tells detectives that Batiste called him for a ride on the afternoon of March 17th.
Yo, Batiste!
That is the same day that Doris is supposed to fly home to the Bahamas.
I need you to give us a ride. All right.
Willis says he knew better than to ask Batiste Kirkman too many questions.
And dude is crazy. Chris and Doris was acting real strange, so I knew something was up.
How were they acting?
Scared.
Next, Willis says he drove to a nearby home improvement store where Batiste went inside, leaving him to wait with Doris and Christopher in the car.
He says that Batiste bought a shovel, duct tape, and several bags of ready-mix concrete.
David said after their trip to the store, Batiste dropped him back home and asked to borrow his car.
After that day, he never saw Doris again.
And he killed that girl.
Any idea why?
Nah. But I heard Batiste talking about where they left her.
He was claiming that she was buried somewhere near the power lines on State Road 524 in Cocoa.
After talking to Willis, detectives bring Batiste Kirkman into the interrogation room.
He had been suspect in several violent crimes.
Batiste was very used to being interrogated by detectives, and they could tell.
As we sat down with him, he was very curious. He asked questions, which is not unusual for a suspect in a crime. They want to know where you stand and what do you have.
Word on the street says you killed Willie Parker.
Never. Not Willie. Willie was a good friend of mine.
He wouldn't give us any information.
Getting nowhere on the Parker murder, detectives turned their focus to Doris.
Yeah, I hear Doris Knowles is a good friend of yours too, isn't she?
You can say that. It's Chris's girl.
When's the last time you saw her?
Been a couple weeks. Last I heard, she was in the Bahamas.
He says that she went back home. He was pretty calm and cool about it.
I hope nothing happened to her.
Detectives have just learned the fate of 22-year-old Doris Knowles from a man named David Willis.
David Willis was claiming that she was dead and that Autiste Kirkman and Christopher Pratt buried her.
After Autiste Kirkman's coy interview goes nowhere, detectives turn their focus to Doris's boyfriend, Christopher Pratt.
Looks like you're getting yourself in some pretty serious trouble.
We beat around the bush a little bit. We told him, maybe if you have any information that'll help you.
What can you tell us about Willie Parker?
I heard he got shot, that's all.
We tried to soften him up a little bit, but he wasn't buying it.
Detectives try to catch Christopher off guard when they change the subject to Doris's disappearance.
What you doing up here in South Carolina? Your girl's been missing for over a few weeks down in Florida.
Look, I took her to the airport, all right? Look, man, when a guy like Batiste asks you to go on a ride to New York, you don't say no.
Christopher says she was supposed to be going to the Bahamas. That's all I know.
The conversation was very, very frustrating.
Christopher refuses to reveal what happened to Doris, but the trip to South Carolina does give detectives plenty to go on.
So they have all of these claims from David Willis about these two being involved in Doris's disappearance.
Once back in Florida, detectives begin building a case against Christopher Pratt and Autiste Kirkman in the murder of Willie Parker and the disappearance of Doris Knowles.
We didn't have a lot of good evidence in the Doris Knowles case yet, so we were still trying to piece that together.
After contacting authorities in the Bahamas, they discover that Christopher Pratt's record isn't as clean as they thought.
He did have a history in the Bahamas that was mainly in drug sales.
Detectives know Christopher was involved in both the Parker murder and Doris's disappearance, but can't shake the feeling that it wasn't his plan.
You could tell, though, he was just like going along with Kirkman.
Next, detectives follow up at the home improvement store, where Autiste supposedly purchased a shovel, duct tape, and concrete.
We knew the date that happened, so we just went through thousands of receipts and finally found a receipt that only had concrete, a shovel, and duct tape.
The purchaser paid cash, so the receipt alone wasn't enough to confirm David Willis's story.
However, a timestamp on the receipt and the store's security footage provide detectives with the proof they need.
We watched Bautiste check out at the counter, and we watched him push the cart out of the door with concrete, a shovel, and duct tape.
So Willie's story checks out, but they still don't know why they would kill Doris and what, if anything, that has to do with Willie Parker.
Police had thought maybe there was a jealousy angle when Doris hooked up with a cop. But now it seems like something totally different.
With Willis, Kirkman, and Christopher Pratt in custody in South Carolina on drug and weapons charges, detectives focus their efforts on finding Doris's body.
David Willis told us that Autiste Kirkman and Christopher Pratt buried her on State Road 524, so we literally got everybody we could and went out there.
We had a front-end loader, we had the ground-penetrating radar, we had the cadaver dog out there.
We dug multiple different locations. We dug hole after hole after hole. We didn't find anything, we didn't see anything.
With frustration mounting, detectives question whether or not David Willis was being truthful about the location of Doris's body.
She could be anywhere.
Without a body, detectives know it'll be hard to convict the men of murder. But they decide it's time to tell Doris's family what they've learned.
That's not a conversation we want to have over the telephone. We did emphasize that we think we know what's happened. We would like you to come over.
Doris's mother and father fly to Florida to meet with the detectives in Cocoa.
They're there with us. We're kind of outlining what we know, that we do believe that they killed her.
The mom was very shocked about Chris's involvement in it. I assured them that we were going to do what we can to try to find their daughter.
Derice's mother offers to assist detectives.
She requests to talk to Christopher Pratt, who's still being held on drug and gun charges from the traffic stop.
Detectives work with the prosecutors to set up a meeting in South Carolina.
She pled for him to give her any information he could to let her know what happened to her child.
Chris sticks to his story, saying the last time he saw Derice was when he dropped her off at the airport.
Just tell me where she is so we can bring her home.
Wish I could help you, but I can't.
Please.
He denied everything, but he cried. It was starting to get to him now.
However, once detectives receive the ballistics report on the gun seized in the traffic stop, they finally have the evidence they need to charge the men with at least one murder.
It was the firearm that was used in the murder of Willie Parker.
In October 2006, Vatisse Kirkman and Christopher Pratt are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Willie Parker and are extradited to Florida.
David Willis identified Kirkman as a shooter and Christopher Pratt as a getaway driver.
Yo, man, let's go, man. Hurry up, man.
It takes 4 years, but Vatisse Kirkman finally goes on trial first in July 2010.
Vatisse Kirkman was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison.
With Vatisse Kirkman convicted of one murder, Christopher Pratt sees the writing on the wall.
If he goes to trial, he could be found guilty and he's going to get life in prison.
It's a risk Christopher isn't willing to take, so he has his attorney reach out to the prosecutors.
Christopher is looking to a plea deal.
The prosecutors are willing, but only if Christopher helps them first.
He would also testify in the Derice Knowles case, and we would have to locate her body.
When you're young and you're in love, you tend to put the blinders on. You don't see things quite as clearly, and you just press on with what you want to do. This is a 22-year-old who was in college, a 22-year-old who had a mother who was concerned about her, who had a father who was concerned, who got into a bad situation, who thought she loved someone, who thought she could trust this man for whatever reason. So it was not just about finding a body, it's about finding a person who was killed.
Four years after she vanished from Cocoa, Florida, detectives believe they're on the verge of learning what happened to 22-year-old Derice Knowles. Prosecutors have offered Derice's boyfriend, Christopher Pratt, a plea deal to avoid a life sentence for the murder of Willie Parker.
He'll only make the plea deal if he tells them the truth about Derice's disappearance.
In August of 2010, Christopher takes the deal.
Me and a couple of prosecutors interviewed him at the courthouse.
We're here really just to talk about Derice Knowles.
Christopher tells detectives it all started when he saw Derice leaving with Officer Shaw.
Shortly before Derice had disappeared, she had hooked up with a Cocoa police officer.
So you see her talking with a police officer, and what happened as a result of that?
Christopher explains that Derice did have a wild side. He couldn't control her, so he didn't try, even though it bothered him.
However, according to Christopher, it wasn't jealousy that drove what happened next.
Instead, he says it was Vatisse Kirkman.
Where your girl at now?
She on a date with some cop.
You sure he's a cop?
Yeah, he been in the neighborhood all the time.
She can tell him about Willie.
Christopher claims he never told Derice anything about the Parker murder or about Vatisse. But just seeing Derice talk to a police officer was enough for Vatisse.
No, she got to go.
Vatisse told him that we had to get rid of Derice because she was friends with the cop.
Christopher says he tried to talk Vatisse out of it, but says he had no choice. It was either Derice or both of them.
I already know we'll take my people below.
Christopher says that when Shaw dropped Doris off at their motel the next day, he already had her suitcase packed and waiting.
He told her that his friends were picking them up and they would take her to the airport.
Chris, what's going on?
It's gonna be okay.
Christopher Pratt said that she trusted him, and he took advantage of that.
Instead of the airport, David Willis drove them all to the home improvement store where Batiste was caught on surveillance.
And I'm dumbfounded by that. You're just gonna sit there and look at the girlfriend knowing what you're about to go do?
Batiste comes back out, puts the shovel, duct tape, and the bags of concrete in the trunk, and then they head back out to David Willis's house.
Chris, I'm scared.
Once they dropped off David at home, under the cover of darkness, Christopher says that Batiste demanded he tape Doris's hands and feet together.
Tape her hands.
No! Chris, no! Chris, please, no! Why? Chris, please, please don't open me!
Then Batiste drove the car to the outskirts of town.
They stop along a wooded area off of 524 in Cocoa.
Dig.
Once again, Christopher says he'd had no choice.
That's when he produced the car.
Christopher says he dug a hole deep enough to hold a body.
What now, man?
So good to put in a hole.
Then, Christopher says he took Doris from the back of the car and carried her to the hole.
Then they got water from a nearby pond to mix with the cement.
And I said, did Batiste Kirkman kill her before putting her in the hole?
She gonna be alive.
I said, well, how do you know she was still alive? And he said, she was looking at me. I can't even imagine the amount of fear in her mind.
Chris says that he covered her face first so he wouldn't have to see her.
After telling his story, Christopher takes detectives out to where they buried Doris.
Gotta be somewhere in this area. I think do a perimeter for 10, 15 feet around here. Somewhere around here.
He didn't act very emotional. It was, I think it's somewhere in here. And that was it. We took him back to jail.
"4 years after their initial search, police finally locate the body of Doris Knowles.
We finally recovered her.
Her remains are sent to her family in the Bahamas. And authorities are finally able to charge Batiste Kirkman and Christopher Pratt with Doris's murder.
Once again, Christopher Pratt cut a plea deal with prosecutors.
When Batiste Kirkman goes on trial in April of 2016, Christopher Pratt is the star witness against him.
On the stand, Christopher basically repeats the detailed account of the murder that he gave to police.
In the end, the jurors see Batiste Kirkman as a cold-blooded killer.
The jury found him guilty of capital first-degree murder.
Thanks to his plea deals, Christopher Pratt will eventually be released.
10 years on the Willie Parker case and 10 years in prison on the Doris Knowles case combined to give him 20 years. And then he would be deported to the Bahamas.
Please, no!
To the investigators who worked the case for over 4 years, it's too little for what Christopher Pratt did to Doris Knowles.
My personal belief is that he just wanted to be seen as a victim, and I was just here because Batiste Kirkman made me be here. But I think in reality, he was upset because she cheated on him, and he knew exactly what he was doing.
For Doris's family and friends, the outcome does little to ease the pain of their loss.
She was a beautiful, fiery woman, and it would have been amazing to see what she would have accomplished if she hadn't been involved with Christopher Pratt.
She trusted this man, and she ended up dead. That's the ultimate tragedy in this whole thing. The betrayal, the loss of a good person.
It doesn't make sense. It's not humane. It's not normal. It's definitely not love. It's evil.
The sub-zero winds of December 1976 did not merely sweep across the industrial sprawl of South Chicago. They froze the city in an iron grip of snow, ice, and suffocating silence. In the blue-collar neighborhood of Bridgeport, a tightly knit enclave of brick bungalows, parish churches, and working-class families, everyone knew their neighbors, and secrets were buried deep beneath the frozen earth. But late on the night of December 14th, 1976, behind a quiet brick home on West 31st Street, that silence was shattered by the rhythmic, unnatural sound of a shovel cutting through hard soil, followed by the muffled idling of a heavy engine idling in the alleyway. By sunrise, the snow had fallen fresh and clean, covering the tracks, swallowing the dark, and hiding a horror that would sleep undisturbed for nearly 5 decades. When 19-year-old Margaret Maggie Sullivan failed to return home from her evening shift at a local diner 3 blocks away, her parents immediately contacted the Chicago Police Department. Maggie was punctual, gentle, and deeply attached to her family. She was not the kind of teenager to run away or vanish into the night. Her coat remained hanging in her bedroom locker at work. Her purse and uncashed paycheck were left sitting untouched on the break room counter. It was as if she had stepped out into the biting winter air and simply ceased to exist. The initial response from the local precinct was slow, paralyzed by the era's prevailing assumption that young women who vanished had simply left town on a whim. But as days turned into weeks, the neighborhood of Bridgeport was gripped by a creeping, paralyzed dread. Front-page tabloid headlines blared across the morning editions. Bridgeport teen vanishes in midnight snowstorm. The community organized search parties, sweeping the icy alleys, checking abandoned rail yards, and dredging the frozen banks of the nearby bubbly creek. Hundreds of neon pink flyers bearing Maggie's smiling portrait were taped to light poles, tavern windows, and church bulletin boards across the South Side. Detective John Callahan, a hardened, chain-smoking investigator from the CPD Homicide Division, stepped onto the case when a local tip pointed toward a terrifying detail. A witness reported seeing a dark, unmarked commercial van idling near the alley behind Maggie's diner at 11:15 p.m. on the night she disappeared. Inside the van, according to the witness, sat a man wearing a heavy dark coat, staring intently at the diner's rear exit door. Callahan swept the alleyway, but the heavy lake-effect snowstorm had obliterated any potential tire tracks, footprints, or biological evidence. The diner's back door was secured, showing no signs of forced entry. Maggie's friends were interrogated, her boyfriends cross-examined, and local taverns canvassed, but every path led straight to a wall of icy silence. The investigation began to feel like hunting a shadow in a blizzard. As winter bled into the spring of 1977, the snow melted, but no trace of Maggie Sullivan emerged. Rumors tore through the working-class streets of Bridgeport like wildfire, whispers of a predatory stranger drifting through the industrial corridors, or worse, a monster living right in their midst, hiding behind a friendly smile and a neatly manicured lawn. The case stalled. Files were packed away into cardboard boxes, stamped with the ominous classification, unsolved missing person. Years turned into decades. The neon pink flyers faded under the summer sun and tore away in the autumn winds. Maggie's parents passed away without ever knowing what had become of their daughter, taking their heartbreak to their graves. The brick house on West 31st Street changed hands, the neighborhood transformed, and the young girl who walked out into a 1976 snowstorm became nothing more than a haunting local legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones over tavern bars. Then came the spring of 2024. A young family had recently purchased the property on West 31st Street, eager to renovate the historic brick bungalow and landscape the overgrown backyard that had sat virtually untouched for decades. On a bright May afternoon, an excavation crew brought in a mini excavator to dig up the decaying concrete patio in the rear garden to lay the foundation for a new wooden deck. At 2:30 p.m., the excavator bucket hit something solid 4 feet beneath the concrete, not a boulder and not a discarded utility pipe. The operator climbed down into the trench to clear the clay with a hand shovel, expecting to find old construction debris. Instead, his shovel blade struck a corroded, heavy iron military-style trunk, wrapped in decaying plastic tarps and secured with thick steel chains wrapped around its center. When the excavation crew pried open the rusted latch, the air was instantly filled with the heavy, acrid reek of preserved decay. Lying inside the trunk, buried beneath layers of vintage lime and crushed gravel designed to accelerate decomposition and neutralize odor, were human skeletal remains. The victim had been placed in a fetal position, still wearing the faded remnants of a 1970s-style winter coat, a silver cross necklace, and a high school class ring inscribed with the initials MS. The Chicago Police Department and the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office swarmed the quiet Bridgeport residential street within 20 minutes. Yellow crime scene tape sealed off the entire block. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalks in absolute shock, watching as forensic anthropologists in white hazmat suits carefully raised the rusted trunk from the dirt. The news broke across Chicago with seismic force. 1976 cold case shock. Buried backyard remains discovered in Bridgeport. Detective Sarah Miller, a relentless 32-year-old cold case investigator with a background in forensic anthropology, was assigned to lead the renewed homicide probe. Standing at the edge of the excavation pit, looking down into the dark soil that had hidden a nightmare for 48 years, Miller knew she wasn't just investigating a murder. She was unearthing the dark, hidden history of a community that had spent decades trying to forget. The forensic examination at the Cook County morgue confirmed what everyone in Bridgeport feared. The remains belonged to Margaret "Maggie" Sullivan. A single, high-velocity gunshot wound to the back of the skull revealed the brutal, violent nature of her death. She had not run away. She had not drifted out of town. She had been abducted, executed, and buried just 4 blocks from her own family's front door, trapped beneath 4 feet of dirt and a slab of poured concrete while her parents searched the city for her. The discovery sent shockwaves through the department, but it raised a terrifying, immediate question: who had owned the property on West 31st Street in December 1976? And how could a teenager be murdered and buried in a quiet residential backyard without a single neighbor noticing a thing? Miller pulled the historical land deeds and property tax records from the Cook County Recorder of Deeds office, tracing the ownership of the West 31st Street bungalow back to the winter of 1976. The house had belonged to Arthur Pendleton, a quiet, 62-year-old retired municipal utilities contractor and World War II veteran who had lived alone on the block for over 30 years. Pendleton was remembered by elderly neighbors as a polite, reclusive man who kept his lawn immaculate, volunteered at the local parish on weekends, and drove a pristine, dark commercial delivery van. Pendleton had died in 1998, taking his secrets to a cemetery 5 miles away. On paper, it seemed like the case was solved: a dead suspect, a buried body, and a closed file. But Detective Miller knew that in the world of high-stakes homicide investigations, the simplest answer was rarely the whole truth. When Miller's team conducted a deep-level forensic sweep of the steel trunk, they discovered something that shattered the theory that Pendleton had acted alone. Inside the trunk, beneath the victim's remains, lay a second set of personal effects wrapped in a plastic bread bag, a set of keychains bearing the logo of a long-defunct Southside auto repair shop, a pair of blood-stained leatherwork gloves, and a custom-engraved silver lighter bearing a distinctive insignia, a coiled serpent wrapped around an iron dagger. Furthermore, a high-resolution microscopic analysis of the soil layers beneath the poured concrete slab revealed that the concrete had not been poured in December 1976, when Maggie vanished. The concrete patio had been poured in the summer of 1978, 18 months after Maggie was buried. That meant for a year and a half, Arthur Pendleton had lived alone in that house, hosting parish summer cookouts and sitting on his back porch, knowing that a teenager was buried 4 feet beneath his grass in a makeshift grave. And even more terrifyingly, the blood-stained leather gloves recovered from the trunk were size extra large, far too large for the small, arthritic hands of 62-year-old Arthur Pendleton. The investigation was no longer just a cold case recovery. It was turning into the unraveling of a dark, multi-person conspiracy hidden deep within the blue-collar fabric of 1970s Chicago. Miller submitted the leather gloves and the plastic bread bag to the Illinois State Police Forensic Science Center for advanced touch DNA extraction, a technology that was pure science fiction when Maggie Sullivan vanished in 1976. For 2 weeks, the automated DNA sequencers worked in total silence, amplifying degraded, microscopic human skin cells trapped within the leather lining of the work gloves. When the digital lab report landed on Detective Miller's terminal, the results detonated the foundation of the case. The touch DNA extracted from the inside of the gloves belonged to a male profile. But it was not Arthur Pendleton. The genetic footprint matched a profile currently existing in the National CODIS database, a profile belonging to 78-year-old Robert Bob Vance, a decorated former Chicago police detective who had served in the very precinct that handled Maggie's original missing persons investigation in 1976. Miller stared at the monitor, her heart pounding against her ribs as the terrifying truth began to take shape. The dark commercial van seen near the diner, the missing evidence files, the cold case, leads that had evaporated into thin air. The concrete patio poured 18 months late. The killer was not just a quiet neighborhood recluse. The killer was a decorated cop who had walked the very streets where Maggie Sullivan vanished, hiding his crime behind a badge, a uniform, and an ironclad wall of blue silence for nearly 50 years. The true nightmare was only just beginning. The revelation radiating from the glowing LED terminal in the early hours of May 28, 2024, transformed Detective Sarah Miller's office into a tomb of suffocating silence. Outside her second-story window at the Chicago Police Department's Area Central Headquarters, the hum of late-night traffic along Michigan Avenue bled through the glass, but inside, time seemed to freeze. A match in the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, was not a speculative lead. It was a mathematical certainty. The microscopic touch DNA extracted from the sweat-stained inner lining of those extra-large leatherwork gloves, buried 4 feet beneath a concrete slab on West 31st Street for nearly half a century, belonged directly to Robert Bob Vance. Former Detective Robert Vance, a man who had worn the star, carried a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, and walked the beat in Bridgeport throughout the 1970s. A decorated lawman who had stood at the crime scenes of South Side homicides, accepted commendations from city aldermen, and retired in 2002 on a full municipal pension. Miller leaned back in her swivel chair, her fingers laced tightly behind her head, staring at the glowing monitor as if expecting the data to shift, to self-correct, to reveal a clerical error. But genetic code did not lie. The probability of a random match was 1 in 1.2 trillion. The man who had been tasked with protecting the blue-collar families of Bridgeport was the very shadow that had consumed Margaret, Maggie, Sullivan on December 14, 1976. Yet, as Miller began pulling Vance's personnel records, service logs, and internal affairs files from the department's digitized historical archives, the tactical reality of the situation hit her like an icy bucket of harbor water. Robert Vance was not a dead recluse like Arthur Pendleton. He was 78 years old, living comfortably in a sprawling waterfront retirement home in Orland Park, Illinois. He was a lifetime member of the Fraternal Order of Police, a frequent attendee at departmental charity galas, and his son, Marcus Vance, was currently a commander within the CPD's Bureau of Internal Affairs. If Miller fired off a standard arrest warrant or leaked her findings through traditional precinct channels, the internal alarm bells would ring immediately. The blue wall of protection that had shielded Vance in 1976 would solidify once again in 2024. Evidence would be questioned, Chain of custody logs from 48 years ago would be challenged by high-priced defense attorneys, and a 78-year-old man with a heart condition would spend his remaining months tied up in pretrial motions until he died peacefully in a hospital bed, taking the absolute truth of Maggie's final hours to his grave. Miller needed more than a DNA match on a pair of gloves buried in a trunk. She needed to understand the mechanics of the crime. She needed to prove how an active homicide detective, a quiet utility contractor, and a 19-year-old diner waitress collided on a snowy midnight in 1976. At 7 a.m., Miller bypassed her immediate supervisor and requested a confidential, off-the-record meeting with Cook County State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, no relation to the suspect, inside a secure briefing room at the Layton Criminal Court Building. Elizabeth, a seasoned prosecutor known for dismantling systemic municipal corruption, listened in absolute silence as Miller laid out the evidence. The aerial photographs of the West 31st Street backyard, the physical excavation logs, the iron military trunk, the gunshot wound to the base of Maggie's skull, and finally, the Cody's printout linking Robert Vance to the leather gloves. When Miller finished, Elizabeth did not speak for a full 2 minutes. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the concrete courtyard below where news vans were still parked, broadcasting live updates on the Bridgeport backyard skeleton. "You realize what you're asking for, Sarah?" Elizabeth said softly, her voice heavy with the weight of the political nuclear bomb sitting on the table. "You aren't just accusing a retired cop of a cold case murder. You are alleging that the Chicago Police Department actively concealed the abduction and execution of a teenager, buried her in a residential yard, and maintained a 48-year conspiracy of silence. If we step into a courtroom with this without an ironclad, airtight case, this department will tear itself apart, and Vance's legal team will tear your career to shredded paper." "Then we don't march into his house with handcuffs yet," Miller replied, her voice firm, unwavering. "We build the invisible perimeter. We trace every shift he worked in December 1976. We find out why Arthur Pendleton let a teenage girl be buried under his concrete patio. And we find out who else held the shovel." Over the next 3 weeks, operating under the top-secret investigative directive codenamed Operation Snowfall, Miller and a small, trusted team of 3 federal analysts operated out of a windowless basement office at the FBI's Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road. They were completely disconnected from the CPD network, utilizing air-gapped terminals to prevent any internal data leaks from alerting Commander Marcus Vance or his father. The team began by dissecting the life and routine of Arthur Pendleton, the retired utility contractor who owned the West 31st Street house in 1976. On paper, Pendleton had been a model citizen, quiet, devout, frugal. But as Miller cross-referenced Pendleton's private financial ledgers, retrieved from his estate filings in the Cook County Probate Archives, with municipal equipment permits from the late 1970s, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. In 1975 and 1976, Pendleton's small municipal contracting business had been awarded dozens of lucrative, unbid city subcontracts for emergency sewer line repairs and alley paving across the South Side, permits that required direct approval from the precinct's Civil Liaison Division. The officer in charge of approving those lucrative subcontracts between 1974 and 1978 was none other than Officer Robert Vance. Pendleton was not just a quiet neighbor. He was on Vance's private payroll. Vance used his badge to divert city repair contracts to Pendleton's firm, and in return, Pendleton's industrial equipment, supply storage yards, and residential property were used as off-the-books storage for Vance's illicit operations. What kind of illicit operations? Miller dug deeper into the precinct's archived vice logs from 1976. In the mid-1970s, the south side of Chicago was rife with illegal gambling dens, loan sharking, and hijackings coming out of the nearby rail yards and maritime docks along the Chicago River. A rogue pocket of officers within the precinct, dubbed the Alley Squad by neighborhood locals, operated as an autonomous extortion ring. They shook down local business owners, protected illegal bookmaking operations, and ensured that any civilian who saw too much was intimidated into total silence. And the headquarters for this rogue ring? A quiet, private tavern located just 2 blocks from the diner where Maggie Sullivan worked. The Shamrock Tap, owned by a relative of Robert Vance. Miller pulled the original 1976 missing person file for Maggie Sullivan once again, laying every page out across a 12-foot wooden conference table. She began rereading the handwritten witness statements taken on the night of December 14, 1976. The first witness statement, taken at 1:30 a.m. by a patrol officer, was from a young line cook at the diner named Jimmy O'Connor. Jimmy had stated that at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Maggie's shift ended, two men in heavy winter coats had entered the rear kitchen corridor of the diner through the alley entrance. They were speaking in low tones with the diner's manager. Jimmy noted that one of the men was carrying a heavy leather clipboard and wore an extra-large gold signet ring featuring a coiled serpent wrapped around an iron dagger, the exact same insignia found on the silver lighter recovered inside the buried iron trunk 48 years later. Miller's breath hitched. She flipped through the rest of the file to see how Detective John Callahan, the original lead investigator in 1976, had followed up on Jimmy O'Connor's statement. To her horror, she found that Jimmy O'Connor's statement had been completely excised from the official final report submitted to the state's attorney in 1977. In the official brief, Callahan had written that no witnesses observed any suspicious individuals near the diner prior to the victim's disappearance. 2 weeks after giving his statement to the police in December 1976, 19-year-old Jimmy O'Connor had abruptly quit his job at the diner, packed his belongings, and moved to rural Indiana, refusing to ever speak about the night Maggie vanished. The cover-up had not happened years later. It had been executed in real time, within hours of Maggie's body hitting the cold earth inside that iron trunk. Miller immediately dispatched 2 federal agents to a small farming community outside South Bend, Indiana, to locate 76-year-old James "Jimmy" O'Connor. When the agents knocked on O'Connor's door on a rainy afternoon in June 2024 and showed him a photograph of the rusted iron trunk recovered from the Bridgeport backyard, the old man collapsed onto his front porch bench, putting his face in his hands and weeping uncontrollably. "I waited 48 years for you to come," O'Connor sobbed, his hands trembling as he held a cup of coffee inside his living room moments later. "I knew they buried her. God forgive me, I knew. But if I said a word, they were going to put me in the river." O'Connor's voice broke the 48-year silence, laying bare the terrifying final hours of Maggie Sullivan. On the night of December 14, 1976, Maggie had accidentally stumbled upon something she was never meant to see. At 10:30 p.m., while taking out the trash to the alley bins behind the diner, she had opened the heavy steel door and witnessed Detective Robert Vance and 2 other men transferring wooden crates of stolen handguns from the back of a delivery truck into the trunk of a dark commercial van. Vance had spotted her in the alley doorway. Instead of fleeing, Maggie had retreated inside and immediately told her manager, a man who was deeply indebted to Vance's loan sharking ring. The manager called Vance directly on the diner's payphone. 20 minutes later, Vance and his partner walked into the back corridor. They told Maggie she needed to come down to the precinct to sign a confidential witness report regarding illegal dumping in the alley. Maggie, trusting the uniform, trusting the star on Vance's coat, had put on her winter scarf, grabbed her purse, and walked out into the swirling snowstorm with Detective Robert Vance. She never walked back in. Jimmy O'Connor had watched through the kitchen window as Vance guided Maggie toward the dark van idling in the snow-choked alley. Standing beside the rear doors of the van was Arthur Pendleton, holding an open iron military trunk. "I saw Bob Vance grab her arm when she realized what was happening," O'Connor whispered, his eyes staring into the dark corner of his living room as if reliving the night in vivid, terrifying detail. She tried to scream, but he slammed her against the side of the van. Arthur opened the back doors. They pushed her inside. "I saw the van drive down the alley toward 31st Street, and 30 minutes later, I heard a single gunshot echo across the roofs through the snowstorm." O'Connor had stayed silent for nearly half a century, terrified that if he ever spoke, the corrupt precinct officers who ruled South Chicago would ensure he suffered the exact same fate. With O'Connor sworn, videotaped deposition in hand, Miller had the narrative link she needed. But she still faced a massive legal obstacle. A 48-year-old eyewitness testimony from a man who had fled the state, combined with touch DNA on a pair of gloves, would be subjected to relentless attack by Vance's defense team. They would claim O'Connor was senile, that the DNA was contaminated, and that Arthur Pendleton, a dead man who couldn't defend himself, was the sole killer who had somehow framed the decorated police detective. Miller needed a physical piece of evidence that linked Robert Vance to the murder weapon itself, the gun that had fired the single 9mm round into the base of Maggie's skull. In 1976, ballistics technology was primitive compared to modern standards. The bullet recovered from Maggie's skull during the May 2024 autopsy was severely deformed, but the Cook County Medical Examiner had successfully preserved the lead fragment inside a sterile glass container. Miller requested an emergency, high-resolution X-ray fluorescence spectrometry scan of the bullet fragment at the Illinois State Police Crime Lab. The scan revealed something extraordinary. The lead bullet had not been manufactured by a commercial ammunition company like Winchester or Remington. The chemical alloy contained a unique, highly specific ratio of antimony, silver, and bismuth, a signature composition characteristic of custom, hand-cast lead bullets produced by private gun enthusiasts who poured their own ammunition in the 1970s. Miller immediately ordered a federal search warrant for a secondary property owned by the Vance family, a hunting cabin in rural Kankakee County, Illinois, that had been purchased by Robert Vance in the summer of 1977. On July 2, 2024, a team of 20 federal agents and forensic technicians descended upon the isolated Kankakee cabin. Using ground-penetrating radar and heavy hydraulic tools, they breached a padlocked root cellar built beneath the cabin's wooden floorboards. Inside the dark, earth-scented cellar, sitting on a workbench covered in 50 years of dust and cobwebs, was a vintage 1970s bullet casting press, several lead ingots, and a wooden box containing 34 hand-cast 9mm rounds. The chemical mass spectrometry analysis performed on the hand-cast bullets recovered from the cabin workbench returned a 100% perfect metallurgical match to the bullet fragment extracted from Margaret Sullivan's skull. The chain was complete. The physical evidence, the eyewitness testimony, the metallurgical signature, and the touch DNA all pointed to a single, undeniable conclusion. The mask was off. The monster of Bridgeport had nowhere left to hide. On the morning of July 10, 2024, a fleet of 6 unmarked federal vehicles pulled silently into the gated driveway of the luxury retirement estate in Orland Park. Detective Sarah Miller stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 4 heavily armed FBI tactical agents and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. They walked up the manicured stone steps and knocked firmly on the heavy mahogany front door. A moment later, the door swung open. Standing in the foyer, wearing a plush bathrobe, holding a morning cup of coffee, was 78-year-old Robert Bob Vance. He looked frail, his white hair thin, his hands bearing the spots of old age. But as his eyes locked onto Detective Miller's badge and the federal agents standing behind her with their weapons at low ready, the frail posture dissolved. His eyes narrowed into 2 cold, hard beads of gray ice, the exact same cold stare that had terrified the business owners of Bridgeport in 1976. Robert Vance, Detective Miller said, her voice echoing clearly across the quiet, suburban cul-de-sac. You are under arrest for the December 14, 1976 kidnapping and first-degree murder of Margaret Sullivan. Vance didn't scream. He didn't drop his coffee cup. He didn't ask what she was talking about. He slowly set his coffee cup down on the foyer table, looked Miller dead in the eye, and let out a long, raspy, cold chuckle. You took your sweet time, kid, Vance whispered, his voice low, dry, and entirely devoid of remorse. I was beginning to think you cops had lost your touch. As the steel handcuffs clicked around the wrists of the former homicide detective, closing a cold case that had slept in the dark for 48 years, the news broke across the city of Chicago like a thunderclap. Chicago 1976 cold case solved. Former police detective arrested for buried backyard murder. The city was gripped by absolute shock, outrage, and a profound, agonizing catharsis. The story of the 19-year-old diner girl who walked out into a 1976 snowstorm was no longer a mystery. The ghost of Bridgeport had finally been dragged into the light of day. 3 months later, in September 2024, a formal reinterment ceremony was held at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Worth, Illinois. Hundreds of community members, elderly Bridgeport residents who remembered Maggie's smiling face, young families who had moved into the neighborhood, and a new generation of police officers who refused to let corruption define their badge gathered under a clear autumn sky. Margaret Maggie Sullivan was finally laid to rest in a pristine marble tomb beside her mother and father, who had spent their lives waiting for her to come home. On the stone marker, beneath her name and dates of birth and death, a single sentence was engraved into the polished black granite. Truth is not buried by concrete, nor erased by time. As the autumn wind rustled the golden leaves above the graveyard, Detective Sarah Miller stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching as white roses were laid upon the stone. The cold case was closed. The killer was facing trial without the possibility of bail, condemned to spend his final days behind the steel bars of a maximum security prison. The snow that had fallen on December 14, 1976, had finally melted, revealing the absolute, unyielding truth beneath, proving to the world that no matter how deep the grave, no matter how heavy the concrete, and no matter how powerful the silence, justice will always find its way back to the surface. The steel doors of the Cook County Department of Corrections disengaged with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, locking 78-year-old Robert Bob Vance inside a 12-by-8-foot isolation cell. To the outside world, his arrest on July 10, 2024, had brought a sensational, explosive climax to a story that had haunted South Chicago for nearly 5 decades. Front-page tabloid banners across Illinois blared in bold, dark ink. The badge behind the backyard grave, decorated Chicago cop indicted for 1976 cold case execution. Outside the Layton Criminal Court building on West 26th Street, news helicopters hovered daily while crowds of local residents, union organizers, and family friends of the late Sullivan family gathered on the concrete plaza. They carried faded pink flyers from 1976 alongside modern printed signs bearing a single, demanding word: justice. Yet, inside the soundproofed interrogation chambers of the FBI Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road, Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance knew that arresting a former homicide officer was merely opening the outer gate of a far larger, deeply entrenched legal labyrinth. It was mid-August 2024. A humid, stifling heat wave had settled over the city, baking the pavement of the Loop and sending waves of shimmering heat off the surface of the Chicago River. Inside room 402 of the Federal Building, the air was icy cold. Miller sat at a polished oak table, her terminal displaying the multi-layered financial and property records of the former precinct's alley squad, the rogue unit Robert Vance had secretly commanded throughout the mid-1970s. Beside her sat Elizabeth Vance, reviewing the mountain of pretrial motions filed by Robert Vance's high-powered legal defense team. The defense had assembled a formidable legal coalition led by Arthur Sterling Jr., a legendary, silver-haired defense attorney renowned for dismantling complex forensic evidence and challenging police chain-of-custody protocols. At 2 p.m., the heavy security door opened. 2 federal marshals escorted Robert Vance into the room. He was dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists secured to a heavy leather waist restraint. Despite his age and the humiliating reality of his incarceration, Vance moved with a slow, deliberate confidence. He sat down across from Miller and Elizabeth, his cold gray eyes scanning the digital monitors before settling on the young detective. "Detective Miller," Vance rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel dragging across concrete. "You look tired. You've been spending too many late nights chasing ghost stories from a decade before you were born." Elizabeth Vance leaned forward, placing a thick black folder on the table between them. "Robert, we aren't here to discuss ghost stories," Elizabeth said, her tone razor-sharp and unyielding. "We are here to present the preliminary indictment brief before the grand jury convenes on Monday. You are charged with first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice." Vance let out a quiet, mocking chuckle, shaking his head slowly. "Indictments are easy, Madam State's Attorney. Convictions are another matter entirely. You have a pair of old leatherwork gloves with microscopic skin cells that your lab techs claim belong to me. Gloves recovered from a dirt pit that sat open to the elements for 48 years. You have the word of Jimmy O'Connor, a senile 76-year-old runaway who fled the state in 1976 and spent 40 years drinking himself to sleep in Indiana. And you have hand-cast lead bullets from an open hunting cabin that half the precinct had access to during deer season in 1977. Vance leaned his elbows against the wooden table, his iron restraints clinking softly against the grain. You think you've got me trapped in a box. But you don't understand how this city was built, kid. You don't understand who signed the checks, who approved the land transfers, and who cleared the streets on December 14, 1976. Miller tapped a command key on her laptop terminal, rotating the screen toward the former detective. Displayed on the monitor was a newly digitized, high-resolution aerial survey map of the Bridgeport neighborhood recorded by the Cook County Highway Department in September 1978. We aren't relying solely on Jimmy O'Connor's memory or the touch DNA on those gloves, Robert, Miller said, her voice completely devoid of emotion as she pointed to a specific grid coordinate on the map. When our cyberforensics team ran a deep-level raw sector restoration on Arthur Pendleton's private estate financial ledgers, the ones recovered from the probate vault last week, we found something your old precinct friends forgot to burn. The monitor shifted, displaying a scanned copy of a handwritten ledger page dated December 16, 1976, 48 hours after Margaret Sullivan vanished. Arthur Pendleton didn't just store equipment for your rogue vice ring, Miller explained, her finger tracing the faded blue ink entries. He kept a meticulous, double-entry payment journal detailing every cash delivery received from your off-the-books commercial hijacking operations. On December 16, 1976, Pendleton logged a cash payment of $5,000 under the entry label, Excavation and Subslab Concealment, Site 31. Vance's cold gray eyes flickered briefly, a microscopic twitch occurring at the corner of his left eyelid. And who authorized that $5,000 cash withdrawal from the Alley Squad private slush account? Miller continued, leaning across the table. The withdrawal slip was co-signed by you and your immediate superior at the precinct, Commander Thomas, the Hammer Sterling. The room fell into an agonizing, suffocating silence. Thomas Sterling had been a legendary figure within Chicago municipal politics, a high-ranking police commander who transitioned into a powerful ward committeeman in the early 1980s before passing away in 2005. But more importantly, Thomas Sterling was the father of Arthur Sterling Jr., the very defense attorney Robert Vance had hired to represent him against the murder indictment. Elizabeth Vance watched the realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Arthur Sterling Jr. isn't just defending you because he's a high-priced criminal attorney, Robert, Elizabeth stated, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. He's defending you because his father's name, his family's political legacy, and the financial foundation of his entire law firm are tied directly to the slush funds generated by your 1976 extortion ring. Vance slowly lowered his eyes to the wooden table, his calm, arrogant demeanor finally beginning to show deep structural fractures. The web of protection he had built nearly 50 years ago was not just unraveling, it was folding in on itself, threatening to consume the very legal dynasty he had relied upon to shield him from the state penitentiary. You think Thomas Sterling was the top of the ladder? Vance muttered softly, his raspy voice devoid of its former condescension. Thomas was a neighborhood enforcer with a gold star on his chest. He took his orders from the downtown executive suites. In 1976, the South Side logistics corridors weren't just moving stolen handguns and hijacked whiskey. They were moving cash, millions of dollars in untaxed, unregistered commercial revenue passing between the rail yards, the maritime docks, and municipal development firms. Vance raised his head, looking directly into Miller's eyes. Maggie Sullivan didn't just walk out into the alley and see a truck full of stolen handguns, detective. She found a leather courier pouch resting on the hood of that dark commercial van. Inside that pouch were the private ledger books detailing the illegal land acquisition manifests for the entire Interstate 90 highway expansion project, manifests that bore the signatures of 2 active federal judges, 3 city aldermen, and the chief legal counsel for the Port Authority. The scope of the crime had detonated far beyond a localized neighborhood abduction. Margaret Sullivan had stepped out of a diner break room to throw away a bag of trash and stumbled directly into the central financial artery of a statewide political machine. "Vance," Miller said, her mind calculating the massive implications. "If you want to avoid spending the rest of your natural life in a maximum security cell at Stateville Correctional Center, you need to put every name, every date, and every land manifest into a sworn, videotaped deposition before the grand jury convenes on Monday." Vance let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of an old, tired predator finally reaching the end of the forest. He looked down at his iron restraints, then back at the 2 women sitting across from him. "Bring me a legal pad, a fresh pack of cigarettes, and the state's attorney," Vance whispered quietly. "I'll give you the names, but you better be ready for the storm that comes when you pull that curtain back." Over the next 48 hours, operating inside an air-gapped, high-security suite at the federal courthouse, Robert Vance delivered a comprehensive, 12-hour videotaped confession. He laid bare the complete operational structure of the 1976 Bridgeport conspiracy. He detailed how the Alley Squad had operated as a private enforcement arm for high-level municipal land developers, how Arthur Pendleton had been selected to construct the buried iron vault beneath his own backyard patio, how Commander Thomas Sterling had ordered the destruction of Jimmy O'Connor's original witness statement, and how the precinct's evidence room had been systematically purged of all physical artifacts connected to Maggie Sullivan's disappearance. On Monday, August 19, 2024, State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance stepped before a special session of the Cook County Grand Jury. Armed with Robert Vance's videotaped confession, the metallurgical ballistics report, the touch DNA analysis, and the restored 1976 financial ledgers, she presented a comprehensive 42-count master indictment. The grand jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes. At 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, the foreman handed the sealed indictment sheets back to the presiding judge. The grand jury returned true bills on all 42 counts, indicting Robert Vance for first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and official misconduct, while issuing secondary conspiracy indictments against 3 surviving former municipal officials who had aided in the late 1970s land acquisitions. When Arthur Sterling Jr. realized the extent of his own father's recorded involvement in the 1976 cover-up, he formally withdrew as Vance's lead defense counsel, citing an insurmountable ethical conflict of interest. The wall of legal protection had completely collapsed. On October 14, 2024, nearly 48 years after Margaret Sullivan vanished into a December snowstorm, Robert Vance was brought before the chief judge of the criminal division at the Layton Criminal Court building for formal entry of plea. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity. Sitting in the front rows were surviving relatives of Margaret Sullivan, retired detectives who had worked alongside John Callahan in 1976, neighborhood residents from Bridgeport, and dozens of young journalists recording every second of the historic proceeding. Vance stood at the defense table, dressed in a dark suit provided by the state, flanked by a public defender. He looked frail, his hands resting on the wooden railing, facing the elevated bench where the judge sat beneath the seal of the state of Illinois. In case number 24, CR 8891, the people of the state of Illinois versus Robert Vance, the judge's voice echoed through the silent courtroom. To the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Margaret Sullivan on December 14, 1976. How do you plead? The courtroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute, so profound that the soft ticking of the wall clock behind the bench sounded like hammer strikes. Vance slowly lifted his head. He looked across the courtroom, his eyes passing over the smiling portrait of 19-year-old Maggie Sullivan resting on the prosecution's evidence easel. "Guilty, Your Honor," Vance said, his voice raspy but clear, echoing across the oak pews. "Guilty." A collective, audible gasp swept through the gallery, followed by soft, weeping sobs from the Sullivan family relatives sitting in the front row. For 48 years, the city of Chicago had carried the weight of an unresolved, agonizing tragedy. Now, spoken aloud in the record of the court, the lie was stripped away forever. On November 12, 2024, Robert Vance was formally sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Due to his age and medical condition, he was transferred under heavy guard to the Medical Secure Unit at the Dixon Correctional Center in Northern Illinois, condemned to spend the remainder of his life behind concrete walls and steel bars, stripped of his police pension, his medals, and his public standing. 2 weeks after the sentencing, on a crisp, brilliant afternoon in late November, Detective Sarah Miller walked along the quiet streets of Bridgeport. The neighborhood was peaceful. The red brick bungalows sat under a canopy of amber and golden autumn leaves. Children played on the sidewalks, and the hum of city life moved forward with a gentle, steady rhythm. Miller stopped outside the house on West 31st Street. The old concrete patio in the rear garden had been completely removed. In its place, the new owners had planted a beautiful, green lawn surrounded by flowering hydrangeas and a small stone garden bench. Sitting on the bench was a small, bronze memorial plaque installed by the local neighborhood association. It bore a simple, elegant inscription: Margaret Maggie Sullivan. December 14, 1976. Never forgotten. Forever home. Miller stood by the iron fence, looking down at the bronze letters reflecting the warm afternoon sunlight. Beside her stepped State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, wrapping her wool coat tightly against the rising autumn breeze off Lake Michigan. "You gave her back her name, Sarah," Elizabeth said softly, looking over at the young detective. Miller shook her head gently, a quiet, peaceful smile touching her lips. "We didn't give her back her name, Elizabeth. Maggie kept her name. She held on to it under 4 feet of earth for 48 years, just waiting for us to listen." As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet streets of Bridgeport, the air felt light, clean, and clear of the acrid smoke and deceit that had shadowed the neighborhood for half a century. The cold case of Margaret Sullivan was no longer a symbol of unsolved terror, institutional corruption, or lingering fear. It had become an unyielding monument to the power of truth, a permanent declaration that no matter how deep the grave, no matter how thick the concrete, and no matter how powerful the silence, the light will always pierce the dark, and justice will always claim its day. The conviction of Robert Vance and his transfer to the Dixon Correctional Center were heralded across the Midwest as the definitive, miraculous conclusion to one of Chicago's most agonizing cold case sagas. The local headlines had reached their absolute climax. The Sullivan family had finally laid their daughter to rest beneath a pristine marble headstone at Holy Sepulchre, and the city's political leadership moved swiftly to assure the public that the dark, corrupt apparatus of 1976 had been completely dismantled. Yet, inside the quiet basement suites of the FBI Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road, the air remained thick with an unsettling, persistent chill. Detective Sarah Miller sat alone at her terminal late into the December nights of 2024, staring at the raw digital disc partition recovered from Arthur Pendleton's estate. On paper, every variable in the 1976 murder of Margaret Maggie Sullivan had been resolved. Robert Vance was serving a life sentence. His co-conspirators in the 1970s land acquisition scandal were facing federal indictments, and the physical evidence, from the touch DNA on the leather gloves to the metallurgical match on the hand-cast 9mm bullet, had stood unbreakable in open court. However, as Miller conducted a line-item audit of the secondary financial ledgers seized from the Alley Squad's private slush accounts, a terrifying, unexamined discrepancy began to emerge from the data. When Robert Vance delivered his videotaped confession in August 2024, he detailed how $5,000 in cash had been paid to Arthur Pendleton on December 16, 1976, to construct the buried iron vault beneath the West 31st Street patio. But as Miller cross-referenced those cash withdrawals against the master ledger of the Shamrock Tap, the private vice headquarters operated by Vance's family, she discovered a second, unlisted cash disbursement made on December 18, 1976. The second payment was for $25,000, 5 times the amount paid to Pendleton. It had been routed through a private telegraphic wire transfer to a small commercial bank in Gary, Indiana. The entry label beside the transaction read simply, "Outside sanitation, Site B." Miller felt an icy knife twist in her gut. Site B. The buried iron trunk beneath the Bridgeport patio had not been an isolated, spontaneous reaction to Maggie Sullivan accidentally witnessing a truck full of stolen handguns. It was part of an established, multi-location disposal protocol. Maggie Sullivan was not the only person buried in the dark soil of 1970s Chicago. Miller picked up her secure phone and called State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. "Elizabeth," Miller said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that cut through the quiet room. "Don't archive the task force files." Robert Vance didn't just build one grave in Bridgeport. He was running a disposal network. An hour later, Elizabeth Vance stepped into the basement command center. The toll of the 6-month prosecution was visible on her face, but her analytical focus remained sharp as Miller pointed to the newly decrypted wire transfer records displayed on the main monitors. "Look at the dates," Miller explained, pointing to the timeline mapping. Between 1972 and 1980, the Alley Squad operated as the primary enforcement unit for the South Side land acquisitions. Whenever a property owner, an uncooperative tenant, or an independent union auditor refused to sign over their land deeds for the interstate highway expansions, they didn't just receive threats from the precinct. They vanished. Miller zoomed in on a secondary file index retrieved from the deep sector recovery of Pendleton's private logs. There were 6 distinct property files listed beneath Site B, spanning from 1973 to 1979. Every entry shared the exact same structural markers as Maggie Sullivan's disappearance. A sudden, unexplained missing persons report filed at the local precinct. A primary witness statement that was mysteriously altered, lost, or excised from the final case brief. A lucrative municipal paving or sewer repair permit awarded to Arthur Pendleton's contracting firm within 48 hours of the disappearance. And an unbid city concrete pouring contract executed over the target property shortly thereafter. 6 more, Elizabeth whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she leaned against the wooden conference table. 6 more families who were told their loved ones simply walked out into the night and never came back. "And look at the locations," Miller added, overlaying the 6 target coordinates onto a modern digital map of Cook County and Lake County, Indiana. The 6 sites were not scattered randomly across the metropolitan area. They formed a precise, linear corridor along the industrial abandoned rail lines and former municipal utility easements stretching from South Chicago through the heavy industrial marshlands of Gary, Indiana. Miller knew that attempting to obtain search warrants for 6 separate commercial and residential properties spanning 2 states based on 50-year-old financial ledgers would trigger an immediate political nightmare. Property owners would fight the warrants, local municipalities would panic over public relations fallout, and the current leadership of the Chicago Police Department, eager to put the Vance scandal behind them, would attempt to reclassify the files as unsubstantiated historical anomalies. If Miller wanted to expose Site B, she needed direct, undeniable physical evidence. She needed to know who was holding the second shovel in Gary, Indiana. Using high-resolution historical satellite radar imagery provided by the U.S. Geological Survey, Miller's team began analyzing the 1976 topographic alterations along the Gary Industrial Corridor. They locked onto a specific 3-acre parcel of land near the Grand Calumet River, a former commercial asphalt storage yard that had been leased by Arthur Pendleton's contracting firm between 1974 and 1981. On paper, the asphalt yard had been abandoned in 1982 and subsequently purchased by a regional industrial scrap firm. But a cross-agency check revealed that the property's private security contract had been paid continuously for 40 years through a trustee account registered to an inactive law firm in Indianapolis, the exact same law firm that had handled the defense trust for the late Commander Thomas Sterling. The shadow was still paying to keep the gates locked. On December 18, 2024, exactly 48 years to the day after the $25,000 wire transfer was made, Detective Sarah Miller, State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, and a specialized team of federal forensic geologists deployed a heavy ground-penetrating radar unit to the abandoned Gary asphalt yard. The morning air was bitterly cold. A thick blanket of gray frost covered the rusted steel beams, discarded shipping containers, and cracked asphalt paving of the desolate industrial lot. The wind off Lake Michigan howled through the skeletal frames of nearby abandoned steel mills, bringing a blinding flurry of lake-effect snow. The team maneuvered the multi-frequency radar rig across the cracked asphalt surface, sending electromagnetic pulses 6 feet deep into the frozen earth. For 3 agonizing hours, the radar screens returned nothing but dense clay, slag, and rusted utility pipes. Then, at 1:45 p.m., as the team swept the rear perimeter near a decaying concrete retaining wall alongside the riverbank, the primary radar monitor emitted a sharp, continuous audio tone. A series of 6 distinct, high-contrast thermal anomalies materialized on the digital display. They were lined up in a precise, mathematical row, spaced exactly 6 feet apart, buried 4 feet beneath the concrete subgrade. Each anomaly measured 4 feet in length, 2 feet in width, and bore the unmistakable, rectangular signature of a reinforced steel military container. Targets acquired, the chief forensic geologist announced, his voice trembling in the freezing wind as he adjusted the monitor's contrast. 6 subsurface metallic enclosures. Dimensions match the Bridgeport iron trunk. We have found Site B. The federal excavation commenced at sunrise the following morning under a heavy military-style security canopy to keep news helicopters and public spectators at a distance. Heavy hydraulic diamond saws cut through the 8-inch asphalt cap, allowing excavators to clear the frozen topsoil. By mid-afternoon on December 20th, 2024, all 6 iron trunks were raised from the frozen earth of the Gary marshland. Inside the climate-controlled mobile crime lab deployed to the site, forensic anthropologists carefully opened the rusted steel latches under high-intensity halogen lamps. The sight that confronted the team sent a shockwave of profound horror through every veteran investigator present. Lying inside the 6 trunks were the skeletal remains of 6 missing citizens from the 1970s, 3 men and 3 women. Like Maggie Sullivan, each victim had been placed in a fetal position, wrapped in plastic tarps, and covered in lime and gravel. And like Maggie, every single victim bore a single, high-velocity bullet wound to the base of the skull. The forensic team recovered personal effects from inside the trunks: rusted watches, high school class rings, silver pocket knives, and preserved leather wallets containing driver's licenses from 1973, 1974, 1975, and 1978. The identities of the Site B victims were established within 48 hours. Danny Cruz, a 22-year-old rail yard union steward who vanished in June 1973 after filing a corruption complaint regarding stolen cargo. Eleanor Vance, no relation, a 30-year-old municipal land auditor who disappeared in October 1974 while reviewing South Side highway deeds. Marcus Thorne, a 45-year-old tavern owner who refused to pay extortion money to the Alley Squad in March 1975. Patricia Patty Hughes, a 19-year-old secretary for the Port Authority who vanished in August 1976. Samuel Sammy Harris, a 40-year-old independent trucking contractor who refused to lease his fleet to Vance's Vice Ring in May 1977. David Miller, no relation, a 28-year-old investigative journalist for a local South Side weekly newspaper who disappeared in November 1978 while looking into Pendleton's municipal contracts. The discovery of Site B transformed the Robert Vance investigation from a single cold case homicide into the unearthing of one of the most prolific, horrifying state-sanctioned serial liquidation operations in American law enforcement history. The news shattered the nation. The Gary killing fields, 6 more buried trunks recovered in 1970s police conspiracy. Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance immediately traveled to the Dixon Correctional Center to confront 78-year-old Robert Vance with the recovery of the 6 Gary trunks. They met inside a secure, soundproofed interrogation room in the prison's medical wing. Vance sat in a wheelchair, breathing through an oxygen tube, his hands resting limply in his lap. Elizabeth Vance laid the 6 post-mortem forensic photographs of the Gary victims on the stainless steel table before him. "We found Site B, Robert," Elizabeth said, her voice dropping into a cold, absolute register. "We found Danny Cruz." We found Eleanor Vance. We found Marcus Thorne, Patty Hughes, Sammy Harris, and David Miller. Vance slowly lifted his head, his frail eyes passing over the photographs of the young men and women whose lives he had stolen half a century earlier. For the first time since his arrest in July, the cold, arrogant, mocking mask he had worn for decades completely shattered. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, sounding like dry leaves blowing across empty stone. "You found David," Vance whispered, his voice raspy, barely audible over the hum of his oxygen concentrator. David was the one who wouldn't stop writing. He kept coming to the precinct, asking about the deeds. "Why, Robert?" Miller asked, leaning over the table, looking dead into the eyes of the man who had ordered an entire generation of citizens into the dirt. "Why did you build an industrial slaughterhouse for the city?" Vance looked at Miller, his eyes filling with a dark, hollow emptiness. "Because we could, kid," he muttered softly, shaking his head. "Because in 1975, we were the law. We had the badges. We had the judges. We had the land contracts. We thought the concrete would hold forever. We thought nobody would ever dig up the yard." On January 15, 2025, in a special session of the Cook County Circuit Court held inside the Dixon Correctional Center Medical Auditorium, Robert Vance formally pled guilty to 6 additional counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of the Site B victims. The judge added 6 consecutive life terms to his existing sentence, ensuring that he would remain locked behind steel bars until his very last breath. Over the spring and summer of 2025, the Site B victims were returned to their surviving families and buried with full community honors in cemeteries across Illinois and Indiana. The 48-year nightmare that had hung over 6 separate families was finally brought into the healing light of truth. On a warm, clear evening in September 2025, Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance stood together at the newly dedicated memorial park built on the former site of the Gary Asphalt Yard. Where a dark, industrial graveyard had sat locked behind rusted gates for 40 years, there was now a beautiful, green public park overlooking the quiet waters of the Grand Calumet River. 6 white birch trees had been planted in a straight line along the riverbank, surrounded by flowering white roses and stone benches. In the center of the park stood a magnificent granite monument bearing the names of all 7 victims: Margaret Sullivan, Daniel Cruz, Eleanor Vance, Marcus Thorne, Patricia Hughes, Samuel Harris, and David Miller. Below their names, carved deep into the polished black stone, was a single, eternal inscription that resonated across 50 years of darkness, struggle, and victory. "The earth may be silent for a season, but truth is eternal. Their light stands unbroken." Elizabeth looked out over the river where the setting sun cast long, golden rays across the water, reflecting off the green leaves of the birch trees. "It's finally over, Sarah," Elizabeth said softly, resting a hand on Miller's shoulder. "Every single one of them came home." Miller smiled quietly, feeling the gentle evening breeze move through the trees, smelling the fresh, clean air free of the deceit and corruption that had shadowed the city for half a century. "Yes," Miller replied gently, looking up at the clear blue sky above. "They're home." The cold cases of 1976 were cold no longer. The buried trunks had yielded their secrets, the wall of blue silence had been smashed into dust, and the light of justice had proven, once and for all, that no grave is deep enough, no concrete is thick enough, and no lie is powerful enough to hide the truth forever. The formal sentencing of Robert Vance for the Site B homicides and the dedication of the Grand Calumet River Memorial Park were heralded across the United States as an unparalleled watershed moment in the history of American forensic justice. To the public watching the national news broadcasts, the narrative had reached its definitive, poetic resolution. The monster who had wielded a police badge to execute 7 innocent citizens across the 1970s was locked away forever in a medical isolation ward at the Dixon Correctional Center. The corruption that had infected the South Side precinct had been laid bare in open court, and 7 families had finally retrieved the physical remains of their loved ones from the dark earth. Yet, Inside the high-security intelligence suites of the FBI's Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road, the silence that followed the trial felt fragile, hollow, and deeply unsettling. It was late October 2025. A cold, howling autumn gale blew off Lake Michigan, rattling the reinforced glass windows of Detective Sarah Miller's fifth-floor office and scattering golden birch leaves across the concrete plazas of the Loop. Miller sat alone at her desk, surrounded by heavy paper evidence cartons that had been marked for long-term archiving in the federal vault. On paper, her task force assignment was complete. Her official report had been submitted to the U.S. Department of Justice, and she was scheduled to return to active homicide rotation at Area Central by the end of the month. Yet, as Miller performed a mandatory final administrative review of the physical evidence manifests recovered from the Gary asphalt yard, her eyes locked onto an unexamined anomaly within the metallurgic report on the 6 steel military trunks. When the Cook County Crime Lab had examined the rusted iron trunks in December 2024, the focus had been entirely on the skeletal remains, the touch DNA extraction, and the hand-cast 9mm bullets. The physical containers themselves, heavy, olive-drab steel ammunition footlockers with reinforced corner brackets, had been identified as surplus U.S. military M2A1 transport cases manufactured in 1968. However, as Miller cross-referenced the serial stamping numbers welded onto the steel latch plates of the Gary trunks against the master inventory logs of the U.S. Army Logistics Command at the Rock Island Arsenal, she discovered a terrifying, uninvestigated discrepancy. The steel trunks recovered from the Gary marshland had not been purchased by Arthur Pendleton's private contracting firm, nor had they been acquired through public military surplus auctions in the early 1970s. The 7 trunks, the one buried beneath the Bridgeport patio in 1976 and the 6 recovered from Site B, belonged to a specific, restricted shipment of 50 heavy transport cases delivered on August 12, 1971, to the private supply depot of the Illinois State Law Enforcement Tactical Division in Springfield. Miller felt a sudden, icy wave of dread freeze the blood in her veins. The trunks had not been sourced by a local precinct vice ring. They were state-issued tactical containment equipment, distributed directly from a centralized law enforcement supply depot 3 years before Maggie Sullivan ever stepped out of the diner break room. And 43 of those 50 steel trunks were still unaccounted for. Miller's hands began to tremble as she pulled up the master distribution registry for the 1971 Springfield shipment. The original delivery voucher bore 2 authorizing signatures. The first signature belonged to then Captain Thomas "The Hammer" Sterling. The second signature belonged to a man whose name sent a seismic shockwave straight through the core of the state's legal establishment, Director Edward A. Vance, Robert Vance's elder brother, a legendary former director of the Illinois State Police who had transitioned into a senior executive advisor for the U.S. Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. before passing away in a private healthcare facility in 2018. Maggie Sullivan, Danny Cruz, and the 6 victims of Site B were not the isolated targets of a local precinct extortion ring. They were merely the regional casualties of a multi-state, industrial-scale liquidation program that operated under the cover of federal interstate highway construction projects across the Midwest throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Miller immediately picked up her secure satellite phone and dialed State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. "Elizabeth," Miller said, her voice dropping to a harsh, controlled whisper that cut through the quiet room like a blade. "Don't sign the archive release forms." Robert Vance wasn't running the machine. He was just the local gravedigger. 20 minutes later, Elizabeth Vance stepped into the basement briefing room. Her face turned ghost white as Miller displayed the Rock Island Arsenal distribution logs alongside the digitized land acquisition maps for the entire Midwest interstate network on the large glass monitors. 50 trunks, Elizabeth whispered, her voice choking as she stared at the glowing blue nodes on the screen. 50 trunks delivered to a state tactical depot in 1971? Look at the logistics routing, Miller explained, pointing to the secondary data tree her cyberanalysts had spent 3 hours extracting from the Rock Island archives. The 1971 shipment was split into 3 distinct operational allotments. Allotment Alpha, 12 trunks assigned to the South Chicago precinct, the 7 we recovered at Bridgeport and Gary. Allotment Beta, 18 trunks routed to the municipal transit corridors surrounding Detroit, Michigan. Allotment Gamma, 20 trunks transferred to the private storage facility of a regional civil engineering firm operating out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Every single site coincides with a major federal interstate highway expansion project executed between 1972 and 1985, Elizabeth realized out loud, her eyes wide with absolute horror. They weren't just clearing uncooperative landowners in Chicago. They were using federal infrastructure grants to finance a multi-state shadow liquidation protocol. Whenever a labor union official, a whistleblowing civil engineer, a land auditor, or an independent journalist threatened to expose the massive bid rigging and financial kickbacks fueling the construction of the Midwestern highway system, the regional enforcement units deployed the same surgical protocol: an abduction near a transit corridor, an execution with an untraceable hand cast round, and an eternal burial beneath a freshly poured concrete subgrade or asphalt highway ramp. The 43 missing trunks were not hidden in backyards. They were entombed beneath the very highways, bridges, and overpasses that millions of citizens drove over every single day. Miller and Elizabeth knew that attempting to investigate a multi-state government conspiracy spanning 50 years through standard judicial channels was an operational impossibility. The current regional authorities in Michigan and Wisconsin would immediately invoke sovereign immunity exemptions, declare the 50-year-old construction manifests unauditable, and bury the task force under a mountain of legal injunctions to prevent the catastrophic economic and political fallout of excavating interstate highways. If they wanted to crack Allotment Beta and Allotment Gamma, they had to bypass the municipal legal system entirely and force the hand of the federal government through undeniable physical proof. They needed to find the master operational ledger, the document that detailed the precise engineering mile markers where the remaining 43 trunks were buried. Miller turned her attention back to 78-year-old Robert Vance, who was currently housed in the medical isolation unit at Dixon Correctional Center. Vance didn't keep those 1976 ledgers in Arthur Pendleton's estate out of sloppy record-keeping, Miller analyzed, her mind racing through the psychological profile of the former homicide officer. He kept them as insurance. If he knew about the Springfield shipment, he kept the master GPS and engineering coordinates locked in a place where even his brother Edward couldn't scrub them. On October 28, 2025, Miller and Elizabeth traveled to Dixon Correctional Center for a final, off-the-record interrogation with Robert Vance. The former detective was in a critical physical decline. He sat in his medical wheelchair, connected to an artificial ventilator, his skin pale and translucent. But as Miller laid the 1971 Rock Island Arsenal distribution voucher on his tray table, his cloudy gray eyes flickered with a faint, chilling ember of recognition. Springfield, Vance rasped, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. You found Edward's vouchers. Where are the 43 trunks, Robert? Elizabeth demanded softly, leaning close to the old man's face. Where are the rest of the victims in Michigan and Wisconsin? Vance let out a dry, wheezing laugh that turned into a wet cough. You think you can dig up the entire Midwestern highway system, Elizabeth? You think the federal government is going to let you tear up 50 miles of interstate concrete because some 1970s union stewards went missing? We don't need to tear up 50 miles of highway, Robert, Miller interjected, placing a high-resolution aerial map of the Interstate 94 corridor between Chicago and Milwaukee on the table. We just need the mile markers. We know Edward kept a secondary set of surveyor's blueprints locked in his private safe deposit box at the Old National Bank in Springfield before he died. Vance stared at the map for a long, silent moment. The arrogant defiance that had sustained him for decades had vanished, leaving only the hollow exhaustion of a man who knew he was staring directly into the abyss of his own mortality. Look at the foundation pylons of the old Des Plaines River overpass on I-90, Vance whispered, his head leaning back against the vinyl headrest of his wheelchair. And the subterranean utility vaults beneath the Marquette interchange in Milwaukee. Edward didn't bury them in dirt. He poured them directly into the bridge abutment footings, while the concrete was wet, at 3 a.m. on rainy nights. Vance reached out with a trembling, spotted hand, grabbing Miller's sleeve with a surprising, desperate strength. "They're inside the bridges, kid," Vance whispered, his eyes wide with a terrifying, haunting clarity. "The bridges are made of them." 24 hours later, operating under a confidential federal national security search warrant authorized directly by the Attorney General of the United States, a specialized team of FBI cyberforensic analysts and federal marshals breached the private safe deposit box of the late Director Edward Vance at the Old National Bank in Springfield. Inside the steel box, wrapped in oilskin paper, were the original, unredacted 1971 civil engineering blueprints for the Interstate 90 and Interstate 94 highway expansion projects. Printed in red surveyor's ink across the structural cross-section schematics of 12 major bridge abutments and overpass pylons were 43 precise engineering coordinates, each marked with a single, chilling label, Seavault, encapsulated. The master ledger of Project Eclipse Midwest was finally in the hands of federal law enforcement. Over the next 6 months, between November 2025 and April 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice, working alongside the Army Corps of Engineers, executed the largest, most secretive forensic recovery operation in American history. Utilizing advanced, non-destructive high-frequency ultrasonic imaging and ground-penetrating radar arrays, federal teams systematically scanned the interior concrete footings of the 12 target bridge abutments across Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin under the cover of scheduled late-night structural bridge maintenance. The ultrasonic scans confirmed the nightmare. Embedded deep within the reinforced concrete footings of the Midwestern highway system were 43 sealed steel transport trunks preserved in absolute darkness, holding the remains of 43 citizens who had vanished between 1971 and 1984. The federal government was forced to confront an unprecedented moral and legal imperative. To excavate 43 bridge footings meant a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure reconstruction effort and a national scandal that would shake the faith of the American public to its absolute core. On May 12, 2026, the President of the United States addressed the nation in a historic, primetime broadcast from the Oval Office. Standing before the national flag, the President formally disclosed the full, unredacted truth of the 1970s highway liquidation conspiracy, acknowledging the recovery of Margaret Sullivan, the 7 victims of Chicago and Gary, and the location of the 43 individuals entombed within the Midwestern interstate footings. For over 50 years, the President declared, his voice echoing across millions of television screens, a dark, unspeakable tragedy sat hidden beneath the very roads that connected our nation. A rogue network of corrupt officials used the power of the state to commit unimaginable crimes, believing that time, concrete, and distance would bury their sins forever. Today, on behalf of the United States government, we deliver the truth to the American people. Every bridge will be cleared, every trunk will be raised, and every victim will be brought home. The national response was a tidal wave of profound sorrow, outrage, and historic catharsis. Over the summer of 2026, federal engineering units executed a massive, multi-state recovery effort, systematically extracting all 43 trunks from the concrete overpasses of Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, identifying every victim through advanced genomic sequencing and returning their remains to their surviving families for dignified burials. On July 10, 2026, exactly 2 years to the day since Detective Sarah Miller had stepped onto the front porch of Robert Vance's Orland Park estate, a grand national memorial was dedicated in Springfield, Illinois. The memorial sat on a serene hill overlooking the Sangamon River. A soaring, 40-foot white marble wall bore the names of all 50 victims of the Midwestern Highway Conspiracy, from Margaret Sullivan to the final civil engineer recovered from the Milwaukee interchange. Sitting in the front row of the ceremony were Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. Beside them sat the surviving relatives of 50 families who had spent half a century waiting in the dark for answers. As the sun began to set behind the marble wall, casting a warm, golden glow across the names etched in stone, Elizabeth turned to Miller, her eyes filled with tears of profound relief. "You changed the world, Sarah," Elizabeth whispered softly. "You tore down 50 years of concrete, Miller looked up at the golden sky, listening to the soft rustle of the summer breeze through the trees, feeling the quiet, absolute peace that filled the air. "We didn't tear it down, Elizabeth," Miller replied gently, holding the silver cross necklace that had once belonged to Maggie Sullivan. "The truth tore it down. We just held the shovel until the light came back." On August 1st, 2026, 79-year-old Robert Vance passed away in his medical isolation cell at Dixon Correctional Center due to terminal respiratory failure. He died alone in the dark, stripped of his pension, his medals, and his family name, knowing that every single body he had ever buried had been pulled into the light, every lie he had ever told had been exposed, and every victim he had attempted to erase had been given back their voice, their honor, and their eternal place in history. The cold case that had begun on a freezing midnight in December 1976 was no longer a story of unsolved terror, institutional corruption, or lingering fear. It had become the ultimate, immortal testament to the unyielding power of justice, a permanent declaration to all generations that no grave is too deep, no bridge is too heavy, and no shadow is powerful enough to hide the truth from the light forever. The death of Robert Vance inside his medical isolation cell at Dixon Correctional Center on August 1st, 2026, was greeted across the United States with a quiet, solemn finality. To the millions of citizens who had followed the national news broadcasts since the historic presidential address in May, the grand narrative of the Midwestern Highway conspiracy had reached its absolute, definitive conclusion. All 50 steel military trunks had been systematically extracted from the concrete footings of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The names of the 50 victims were carved forever into the white marble of the Springfield National Memorial, and the dark shadow of the 1970s alley squad had been exposed to the harsh, cleansing light of federal justice. In the late summer of 2026, the temporary task force offices at the FBI's Chicago field office on West Roosevelt Road were finally being disassembled. Technicians were packing away server racks, security teams were shredding classified briefing memos, and the air-gapped terminals that had hosted Operation Snowfall were being reformatted for standard federal operations. Detective Sarah Miller sat alone in her empty fifth-floor office, watching the soft golden light of a late August afternoon filter through the dusty window blinds. Her desk was cleared, her official transfer back to Area's Central Homicide was finalized, and her personal belongings were packed neatly into a single cardboard box sitting beside her chair. Yet, as Miller reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, velvet-lined box containing the replica of Margaret, Maggie, Sullivan's silver cross necklace, a gift given to her by the surviving Sullivan relatives following the Springfield dedication, her thumb traced the metallic edge, and her mind returned to a single, unresolved detail from the master blueprints seized from Director Edward Vance's Springfield bank vault. When federal cyber analysts had decrypted the 1971 civil engineering schematics for the Interstate 90 and Interstate 94 expansions, they had focused exclusively on the 43 red ink coordinates labeled C-Vault, encapsulated. Those 43 coordinates, combined with the 7 trunks recovered at Bridgeport and Gary, completed the exact tally of 50 steel transport footlockers delivered from the Rock Island Arsenal in August 1971. Every trunk was accounted for. Every body had been named. Every mathematical variable in the physical evidence brief had hit an absolute zero. Except for a single, handwritten margin note written in faded blue draftsman's ink on the bottom right corner of sheet 12, the structural layout for the central bridge abutments of the O'Hare International Airport Freight Access Corridor. The note did not bear a red C-Vault coordinate tag. It was written in Edward Vance's distinctive, copperplate script, consisting of 5 short words accompanied by a secondary hardware serial number. Recording matrix B12, active. Miller stared at her notebook, where she had copied down that margin note months earlier. Recording matrix B12. In 1971, when the Illinois State Police Tactical Division took delivery of the 50 steel transport cases from Rock Island, they had also acquired 8 military-grade reel-to-reel wire recording units designed for long-term covert surveillance, audio preservation, and high-security structural monitoring. The 43 bodies encapsulated in the bridge footings were physical remains, but Edward Vance, a master of political paranoia who had served at the highest levels of state government for 2 decades, had not relied solely on concrete to protect himself from his high-level political partners in Washington and Springfield. Edward Vance had recorded the authorizations. Every telephone call approving the liquidation of a land auditor, every late-night radio dispatch coordinating a highway cargo diversion, and every verbal directive issued by municipal, state, and federal officials between 1971 and 1982 had been captured on high-purity magnetic wire and preserved inside a secondary, hardened containment vault. Miller felt a cold, sharp electric shock run through her spine. The 50 bodies were the casualties of the machine, but recording matrix B12 was the voice of the machine itself, the audio ledger containing the exact names, voices, and spoken orders of every living or dead politician, judge, and federal administrator who had authorized the Midwestern Highway Liquidation Protocol. Miller immediately picked up her secure phone and dialed State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. "Elizabeth," Miller said, her voice dropping into a razor-thin, urgent register that cut through the silence of the empty office. "Don't leave the building. The story isn't over." Edward Vance left an audio ledger. 10 minutes later, Elizabeth Vance walked into Miller's empty office, her brow furrowed as Miller displayed a high-resolution digital zoom of Sheet 12 from the 1971 O'Hare Access Corridor schematics on her portable laptop terminal. "A recording matrix?" Elizabeth asked, leaning over the screen, her eyes scanning the faded draftsman's ink. If Edward Vance kept an audio archive of the authorization orders, why wasn't it in his Springfield bank vault alongside the blueprints? Because Edward was a master of operational compartmentalization, Miller explained, pointing to the structural cross-section of the O'Hare Freight Access Overpass. The Springfield bank vault contained the physical recovery blueprints, the insurance policy he held against his regional enforcers like his brother Robert. But recording matrix B12 was his insurance policy against the federal government itself. "Where is it?" Elizabeth asked, a dark foreboding creeping into her voice. Miller zoomed in on the structural foundation diagram for Pylon 4 of the O'Hare Freight Corridor. Deep within the subterranean drainage and utility vault built directly beneath Pylon 4, a restricted, high-security municipal drainage chamber located 30 feet below the tarmac of one of the busiest cargo airports in the world, sat an inactive 1970s environmental monitoring station that had been decommissioned during the airport's expansion in 1988. On paper, the monitoring station was a vacant, concrete utility room filled with rusted pipes and abandoned electrical junction boxes. But according to the 1971 blueprint schematics, built behind the secondary moisture barrier of Vault P4 was a reinforced, lead-lined steel safe hardwired directly into the airport's primary emergency power grid, a safe designed to preserve magnetic wire recordings in an airtight, dry climate for over a century. Miller and Elizabeth knew that attempting to access a subterranean utility vault beneath O'Hare International Airport through standard municipal channels would trigger an immediate administrative nightmare. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, the Chicago Department of Aviation, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security would demand multi-agency oversight, formal clearance reviews, and public disclosure risk assessments. If the audio ledger was touched by bureaucratic hands before it was secured by the task force, the lingering shadow of the old state network, the descendants of the political machine who still held high-level appointments across Washington and Chicago, would attempt to suppress, seal, or destroy the recordings under the guise of national security exemptions. If Miller and Elizabeth wanted to secure recording matrix B12, they had to execute a dark, off-the-books extraction, just as they had done during the early phases of Operation Snowfall. At 1:30 a.m. on September 2, 2026, a heavy late-summer rainstorm battered the Chicago metropolitan area, sending sheets of gray water cascading across the dark runways and cargo ramps of O'Hare International Airport. High-intensity floodlights reflected off the wet tarmac, casting long, distorted shadows across the massive industrial cargo hangars on the airport's western perimeter. A nondescript black utility van carrying Detective Sarah Miller, State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, and 2 trusted federal cyberforensic technicians pulled into the restricted service alley behind Cargo Hangar 7. Dressed in high-visibility airport maintenance attire and carrying federal tactical access credentials authorized directly by the regional director of the FBI, the team bypassed the perimeter security gate and navigated through the labyrinthine underground service tunnels running beneath the airfield. The air inside the concrete service tunnels was thick with the reek of jet fuel, ozone, and damp earth, punctuated by the rhythmic, deafening roar of jet engines taking off thousands of feet above their heads. They reached the heavy, padlocked steel access door marked Vault P4, municipal drainage and utility substructure. Using a high-frequency hydraulic cutting tool, the federal technicians severed the rusted iron padlocks on the access hatch. Miller pushed the heavy steel door open. The team stepped inside, their tactical flashlights cutting through a 30-year-old blanket of dark, stagnant air. Vault P4 was a massive, subterranean concrete chamber filled with massive water pipes, heavy sump pumps, and banks of decaying electrical transformers from the early 1970s. Condensation dripped continuously from the exposed concrete ceiling beams 30 feet above, creating a steady, rhythmic ticking sound that echoed through the dark vault like an ancient clock. Target location, a technician announced, pointing a thermal radar scanner at the far eastern wall of the vault. Behind that secondary concrete moisture barrier, the team deployed a handheld diamond core saw, cutting through a 4-inch panel of vintage cinderblock. The saw kicked up a dense cloud of gray concrete dust that hung suspended in the air under the halogen beams. Behind the cinderblock wall sat a heavy, vintage 1970s military-grade steel safe, its surface painted in olive drab, sealed with heavy rubber gaskets and featuring a mechanical 3-wheel combination lock. The safe bore a metal brass tag riveted to its door plate, U.S. Army Signal Corps, Surveillance Archive Matrix B-12. The federal cyber technician connected an electronic acoustic diagnostic sensor to the safe's combination dial, utilizing computer-assisted audio analysis to detect the mechanical tumbler drops inside the vintage lock. Click, click, click. For 45 agonizing seconds, the digital diagnostic monitor analyzed the mechanical vibrations. Then, with a heavy, metallic clack, the primary locking bolts disengaged. Miller stepped forward, took hold of the heavy chrome handle, and pulled the safe door open. A dry, cool puff of nitrogen-preserved air escaped from inside the vault. Lying on stainless steel shelves inside the lead-line safe were 16 heavy, vacuum-sealed aluminum canisters, each containing a reel of high-purity, military-grade magnetic recording wire. Every canister was labeled in Edward Vance's precise, copperplate handwriting, detailing dates, operational codes, and specific administrative file numbers.
Canister 01, autorisation log 1971 à 1973 des Plaines Corridors.
Canister 02, executive dispatches, 1974 to 1975 South Side land acquisition. Canister 03, financial kickback directives, 1976 Bridgeport and Gary. Canister 16, master executive index, codename Overlord. Miller reached into the safe with gloved hands, carefully lifting canister 16 from the shelf. Beside the canisters lay a vintage, battery-operated U.S. military wire playback deck, fully restored and maintained inside a sealed silica gel case. "We play canister 16 right now," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling in the freezing dampness of the subterranean vault. "We need to know who Overlord is before we leave this airport." The technician carefully loaded the thin, silver magnetic wire from canister 16 onto the playback spools of the military deck, connecting the audio output line to a high-definition digital recording terminal and a portable studio speaker. He pressed the mechanical play toggle. The spools began to spin with a faint, rhythmic whirring sound. Soft tape hiss echoed through the concrete chamber, followed by a sharp, electronic tone indicating an encrypted military recording. Then, a voice broke through the speaker, clear, undegraded, and terrifyingly crisp. It was the deep, commanding, aristocratic voice of Director Edward Vance, recorded in his Springfield office on the evening of November 10, 1976. "This is Director Edward Vance," the recorded voice announced into the quiet vault. documenting Operational Authorization Directive 76, be regarding the South Side Infrastructure Clearing Protocol. A second voice spoke through the speaker, a voice captured via a high-grade telephone line tap. The second voice was smooth, highly educated, and resonant with absolute, unassailable political power, a voice that had dominated Illinois and national politics for 4 decades, belonging to a man who is currently serving as a senior elder statesman in the United States Senate, Senator William A. Holland. Edward. Senator Holland's 48-year-old recorded voice rang through the underground chamber. Has the Bridgeport problem been managed? The young woman from the diner? Robert is handling the physical containment tonight. Edward Vance's recorded voice replied smoothly. She will be placed inside a steel footlocker beneath Arthur Pendleton's patio. The paper records at the precinct have been scrubbed by Thomas Sterling. Good, Senator Holland's voice answered without a single second of hesitation, coldness radiating through the wire. Ensure the entire alley squad understands the stakes. The federal transportation grants for the highway corridor depend on complete, absolute silence. If anyone else asks questions, whether they are land auditors, union stewards, or journalists, deploy the same protocol. Clean the corridor. Enforce the state. Understood, Senator. Edward Vance recorded voice concluded. The concrete will be poured by morning. The magnetic wire reel came to a soft stop, the spool spinning freely in the quiet chamber. Maya Lynn, no, Detective Sarah Miller, and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance stood completely frozen in the dark vault, the tape hiss from the speaker echoing against the concrete walls like an icy wind blowing over an open grave. The ultimate architect of the Midwestern Highway conspiracy was not a dead police commander, not a retired homicide detective, and not a regional civil engineer. The ultimate shadow master who had authorized the murder of Margaret Sullivan, the 7 victims of Chicago and Gary, and the 43 souls buried within the highway footings was Senator William A. Holland, a man who had spent 50 years receiving national honors, passing federal legislation, and posing as the ultimate moral pillar of American public service. He had ordered the execution of a 19-year-old diner girl to protect a federal transportation grant. He had authorized 30 years of liquidations to build a political dynasty. And he had allowed Robert Vance and Edward Vance to run an industrial slaughterhouse across 4 states while he sat in the halls of the United States Capitol. Elizabeth Vance stood leaning against the concrete wall of the vault, her face pale, her eyes burning with an incandescent, lethal rage.
William Holland.
Elizabeth whispered, her voice shaking with an overwhelming, absolute fury. He sat at the head of the memorial service in Springfield 3 months ago. He held Maggie Sullivan's aunt's hand and wept for the camera. He thought Edward Vance took the tape to his grave. Miller said, her voice dropping into a register so cold, so sharp, it sounded like snapping steel. He thought because Robert Vance died in Dixon Prison last month that the book was closed forever. Miller carefully lifted the 16 aluminum canisters from the safe and placed them inside a heavy, climate-controlled titanium transport case. Elizabeth, Miller said, locking the transport case shut with a heavy mechanical click. Call the special prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice.
Call the director of the FBI.
We are flying to Washington, D.C. tonight. At 6 a.m. on September 3rd, 2026, a high-speed federal convoy pulled up to the private residence of 84-year-old Senator William A. Holland in the exclusive neighborhood of Colorama in Washington, D.C. The morning air in the nation's capital was crisp, clear, and bright as the sun rose over the dome of the U.S. Capitol building in the distance. A specialized tactical unit from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, accompanied by Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, breached the front gates of the senator's historic brick mansion. They found Senator William Holland sitting in his grand, mahogany-lined library, wearing a dark wool suit, preparing to leave for a morning committee hearing on federal judicial appointments. He turned as the federal agents flooded his library, his distinguished, silver-haired demeanor showing a brief, momentary flicker of irritation. What is the meaning of this outrage? Holland demanded, his cultured, booming voice echoing off the book-filled walls. I am a United States Senator who authorized this intrusion. Detective Sarah Miller stepped past the tactical team, carrying a portable digital audio player and a federal arrest warrant for high treason, first-degree murder, and official conspiracy signed directly by a panel of federal judges. Miller placed the audio player on the senator's mahogany desk and pressed play. Senator Holland's own voice, captured 48 years earlier on a rainy November night in 1976, filled the Grand Library. Ensure the entire alley squad understands the stakes. If anyone else asks questions, deploy the same protocol. Clean the corridor. Enforce the state.
Senator William A. Holland froze.
The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking like crumpled, gray parchment. The arrogant, untouchable posture that had sustained him through 50 years of national power completely collapsed. The glass of orange juice he was holding slipped from his hand, crashing onto the oriental rug, spilling its contents across his polished shoes. "Edward," Holland whispered, his voice cracking into a frail, terrified squeak. Edward recorded it. "Yes, Senator," Elizabeth Vance said, stepping forward, her eyes locked onto the old man with absolute, uncompromising justice. Edward recorded every word. "And now the entire world is going to hear what you did to Margaret Sullivan." Two federal marshals moved in, pulling the 84-year-old senator from his desk and slapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The news broke across the globe at 8 a.m. on September 3, 2026. The arrest of a sitting United States senator for ordering the 1976 cold case murder of a 19-year-old diner girl detonated across international news networks like a nuclear charge. The entire American political establishment was shaken to its absolute foundations as the complete, unredacted audio recordings from Recording Matrix B-12 were presented before a special emergency session of the U.S. Congress. Senator William A. Holland was formally impeached, stripped of his federal office, denied bail, and remanded into federal custody at the maximum security federal correctional institution in Maryland. His trial, held in late 2026 under global media coverage, resulted in a conviction on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, condemned to spend his remaining days in a federal cell, stripped of his honors, his title, and his freedom, remembered forever as the ultimate architect of the Midwestern highway murders. On December 14, 2026, exactly 50 years to the day since Margaret Maggie Sullivan stepped out into a Chicago snowstorm, a special candlelit vigil was held at the Springfield National Memorial. Thousands of citizens from across the nation gathered around the white marble wall as the sun set over the Sangamon River. 50 lit candles burned brightly at the base of the monument, casting a warm, flickering glow across the 50 names etched in stone. Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance stood together at the center of the wall, looking down at Maggie Sullivan's name illuminated by the golden candlelight. The 50-year war was over. Every grave had been emptied. Every lie had been exposed. Every corrupt cop, contractor, director, and senator had been brought to justice, and every single soul had been brought home into the light. Elizabeth turned to Miller, wrapping her arm gently around the young detective's shoulders. "It's finished, Sarah," Elizabeth whispered softly, a tear rolling down her cheek, reflecting the warm glow of the candles. "The entire machine is gone." Sarah Miller took a deep breath of the crisp, clean winter air, feeling the soft snowflakes begin to fall gently from the night sky, clean, pure, and quiet, washing over the white marble wall. She looked up at the stars shining brightly above the river, feeling an overwhelming, quiet, and eternal peace fill her heart. "Yes," Sarah whispered, a beautiful, radiant smile touching her lips as the snow fell softly around them. "The light one. Maggie is finally at peace." The conviction of Senator William A. Holland in late 2026 and his subsequent transfer to a maximum security federal medical facility in Maryland were hailed across the globe as the final, historic triumph of American justice. The 50-year-old web of silence, stretching from the snow-slicked alleys of South Chicago to the highest marble corridors of the United States Capitol, had been systematically torn down. The audio reels from Recording Matrix B 12 were enshrined in federal archives as an undeniable testament to accountability, while 50 families across 4 states stood on the serene grounds of the Springfield National Memorial, finally knowing that those who had authorized the highway liquidations would spend their remaining days behind bars. By early spring 2027, the relentless news cycles had shifted to new national headlines. The public narrative had reached its long-awaited, cathartic resolution. At the Chicago Police Department's Area Central Homicide Division, Detective Sarah Miller had settled back into her routine, working active cases under the familiar, flickering fluorescent lights of the third-floor bullpen. The temporary task force rooms on Roosevelt Road were gone, transformed back into standard federal field offices. Yet, as the icy winds of March swept across Lake Michigan, melting the last stubborn snowdrifts along the Bridgeport pavement, Sarah Miller found herself returning to a single, haunting anomaly that had nagged at her subconscious since the night recording Matrix B-12 was retrieved from beneath O'Hare International Airport. It was not a missing body, nor was it an unassigned steel military trunk. The 50 footlockers delivered from the Rock Island Arsenal in 1971 were accounted for, down to the last rusted latch plate. Every single name etched into the Springfield marble wall matched a specific coordinate extracted from the Des Plaines, Gary, and Milwaukee Bridge footings. The anomaly was hidden inside Canister 16, the master executive audio index. When federal sound engineers processed the raw, multi-channel magnetic wire from Canister 16, they had focused almost exclusively on the direct telephone calls between Director Edward Vance and Senator William Holland. Those explicit, cold-blooded directives had provided the ironclad evidence that put Holland in handcuffs. But beneath the primary vocal tracks, recorded on an auxiliary channel designed to capture environmental room audio inside Edward Vance's private Springfield office, was a low-frequency, rhythmic acoustic pulse that occurred every time an authorization file was opened or sealed. The sound engineers had initially dismissed the background noise as mechanical interference caused by the vintage, wire playback heads. However, during a quiet weekend in late March 2027, Miller resubmitted the raw digital audio files from Canister 16 to the Acoustic Research Laboratory at the Illinois Institute of Technology for high-resolution waveform separation. The laboratory returned the spectrographic analysis 48 hours later. The background pulse was not electrical hum, nor was it a mechanical defect in the recording wire. It was the precise acoustic signature of an automated, high-frequency radio telemetry link, a shortwave data burst transmitted via an auxiliary antenna mounted on the roof of the Springfield Tactical Depot every time Edward Vance processed an operational file. Miller felt a sudden, visceral chill freeze the air in her lungs. Edward Vance had not merely recorded Senator Holland's phone calls onto magnetic wire reels for his own personal blackmail insurance inside the O'Hare vault. Every time a liquidation file was generated, a live, encrypted shortwave data packet was automatically broadcast across an international maritime frequency, bouncing through commercial relay towers along the St. Lawrence Seaway toward an unlisted receiving terminal located far beyond the territorial borders of the United States. The Midwestern Highway Liquidation Protocol was not an isolated domestic cover-up conceived by local cops and regional land developers. It was a single operational node in an international, transoceanic corporate network that had used major transportation infrastructure projects across North America and Europe to fund off-the-books intelligence operations, illegal biological supply chains, and private asset liquidations throughout the Cold War era. Miller sat back in her chair, staring at the spectrographic frequency readouts glowing on her monitor. The shadow that had swallowed Margaret, Maggie Sullivan on December 14, 1976, did not stop at the edge of the Chicago city limits, nor did it end at the gates of the United States Senate. She picked up her phone and dialed State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance. "Elizabeth," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a tense, razor-thin register. "Don't close your notebook." The signal didn't stay in Springfield. 15 minutes later, Elizabeth Vance walked into Miller's office, her expression growing pale as Sarah displayed the spectrographic radio telemetry mapping on her terminal screen. "A short-wave relay?" Elizabeth asked, leaning over the desk as she traced the blue frequency lines extending off the eastern seaboard. Where was Edward's transmitter sending those data bursts? Look at the destination node, Sarah explained, zooming in on an unlisted commercial radio station registered in late 1970 to a maritime salvage corporation based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, a firm named North Atlantic Logistics Group. On paper, Sarah continued, North Atlantic Logistics was an offshore marine recovery contractor handling deepwater salvage along the North Atlantic shipping lanes. But when we cross-referenced their 1970s corporate registry against Federal Intelligence Archives, we found that the firm was owned by a private European holding company registered in Zurich, Switzerland, the exact same parent entity that financed the construction of the deepwater container terminals in Sydney, Australia, and Boston, Massachusetts. Elizabeth took a deep breath, resting her hands against the wooden desk as the sheer, terrifying scope of the revelation materialized in her mind. The 1976 execution of Maggie Sullivan in Bridgeport, the 1993 warehouse execution of Arthur Pendleton in Boston, and the 2005 waterfront murder of Claire Sterling in Sydney were not separate historical tragedies. They were interconnected limbs of a single, global shadow leviathan that had operated across the Western world for nearly half a century, a leviathan that used local police vice squads, corrupt judicial officers, and international maritime logistics firms to erase anyone who dared to audit its books. Sarah, Elizabeth whispered softly, looking her dead in the eye. If this network extends to Europe and the Pacific, we are looking at a system that spans 3 continents. How do you fight something that has no national borders? We don't fight it alone, Sarah replied, a cold, unyielding light burning in her eyes. We connect the files. Over the next 2 weeks, operating under a confidential international intelligence directive authorized directly by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Miller and Elizabeth compiled a master, cross-jurisdictional evidentiary brief codenamed Project Horizon. They linked the acoustic telemetry data from Canister 16 in Chicago to the 1993 touch DNA and chemical solvent records recovered from the Boston Atlantic Logistics Warehouse and cross-referenced both against the encrypted digital logs seized during Operation Nightfall in Sydney, Australia. The physical and digital evidence matched with absolute mathematical perfection. The same high purity, military-grade synthetic aviation hydraulic fluid used as an operational token across 4 decades. The same automated, encrypted shortwave telemetry protocols used to verify target liquidations. And the same corporate trustee accounts used to purchase silence, buy property, and bury human beings beneath concrete, asphalt, and ocean floors. On April 14, 2027, an unprecedented, secret international law enforcement summit was convened at the headquarters of Interpol in Lyon, France. Sitting around a massive circular conference table were lead investigators, prosecutors, and intelligence directors from 4 nations, Detective Sarah Miller and State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance representing the United States, Detective Inspector Maya Lin and Senior Crown Prosecutor Arthur Sterling representing Australia, alongside senior counterintelligence directors from the United Kingdom, Canada, and Switzerland. For 3 uninterrupted days, the international team laid out their evidence, connecting the names of 264 victims who had been executed across Chicago, Boston, London, Sydney, and Geneva between 1971 and 2024. As the final digital node was mapped onto the grand glass wall of the Lyon Command Center, the full, unredacted architecture of the global network stood exposed in the light for the very first time in human history. There were no more missing links. No more unopened vaults. No more phantom hitmen hiding behind blue walls or high judicial benches. The combined evidence provided by the 1976 Chicago cold case, the 1993 Boston cold case, and the 2005 Sydney cold case formed an absolute, unassailable legal net that no corporate firm, no corrupt lawman, and no political dynasty could ever break. On May 1, 2027, a simultaneous, multinational tactical strike, code-named Operation Omni, was launched across 12 major cities worldwide. Federal agents, Interpol operatives, and specialized military counterintelligence units executed over 140 high-level arrest warrants in a single, coordinated hour. Corporate headquarters were seized in Zurich, Maritime shipping registries were impounded in Halifax and Sydney, and the remaining living executives, compromised intelligence coordinators, and financial facilitators who had protected the global shadow network for 50 years were taken into custody without a single shot being fired. The news shattered the global media landscape, sending shockwaves through every financial market and government institution on Earth. Global shadow network dismantled. Interpol and U.S. Task Force expose 50-year international cover-up originating from 1976 Chicago cold case. The story of Margaret Maggie Sullivan, the 19-year-old diner girl from South Chicago who had walked out into a 1976 snowstorm to throw away a bag of trash, had become the singular, immortal key that unlocked the greatest victory for global justice in modern history. Her courage in her final moments, her refusal to stay silent when she saw corruption in an alley, and the silver cross necklace she had carried into 4 feet of dark earth had reverberated across 50 years and 3 continents, bringing down an empire of shadows that believed it was invincible. On June 14, 2027, the 51st anniversary of the day Maggie Sullivan's family had first reported her missing, a magnificent, global memorial sanctuary was dedicated on a high cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean near Halifax, Nova Scotia. The monument featured a soaring, 80-foot polished granite archway framed by 264 individual bronze lanterns, one for every soul recovered across Chicago, Gary, Boston, London, Sydney, and Geneva. Thousands of people from around the world gathered along the coastal bluffs as the evening sun set over the North Atlantic, casting a brilliant, golden light across the water. Standing side by side at the base of the granite archway were Detective Sarah Miller, State's Attorney Elizabeth Vance, Detective Inspector Maya Lynn, and Arthur Sterling. The 4 investigators, who had dedicated their lives, risked their careers, and fought through decades of deceit to honor the victims, looked out at the ocean as the 264 lanterns were lit one by one, their warm flames burning brightly against the falling twilight. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, holding a single white rose, and placed it beside the central plaque bearing the names of Margaret Sullivan, Claire Sterling, Sarah Vance, and Arthur Pendleton. He looked over at Sarah Miller, a gentle, profound smile gracing his features. "It started in your city, Sarah," Arthur said softly, his voice carrying clearly over the gentle rush of the ocean waves below. "A young girl in the snow who refused to let them hide the truth." Sarah Miller reached into her coat, pulling out the small silver cross replica, and held it tightly in her palm. She looked out at the vast, shimmering Atlantic Ocean, feeling the cool sea breeze move past, clear and fresh, completely free of the dark smoke and deceit that had shadowed the world for half a century. "She didn't just hold the truth, Arthur," Sarah whispered gently, her eyes shining with quiet, eternal peace. "She guided us all the way home." The cold cases were solved. The global darkness was gone forever. The harbors, the highways, the foundation slabs, and the ocean depths had surrendered every secret they had ever kept. And as the golden light of the sanctuary lanterns burned brightly into the clear, starry night, the truth stood triumphant, unyielding, and eternal, a shining beacon declaring to all generations that no matter how deep the grave, no matter how thick the concrete, no matter how powerful the conspiracy, and no matter how vast the ocean, the light will always pierce the shadow, and justice will reign forever. The multinational dismantling of the global shadow network under Operation Omni and the lighting of the 264 lanterns along the Halifax bluffs were celebrated across the international legal community as the absolute, crowning achievement of modern criminal justice. To the global press, the saga had achieved a poetic, cosmic perfection, an unbroken line of truth stretching from a cold 1976 Chicago alleyway to the high financial sanctuaries of Zurich, bringing down an international cabal that had operated with total impunity for over half a century. By the autumn of 2027, the world had begun the slow process of moving forward. The international media circus that had engulfed Lyon, Sydney, and Washington, D.C. gradually subsided. At CPD Area's Central Homicide